The Committee on Oversight and Government Reform will come to order, and without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. The United States federal government plays an important role in the lives of its citizens, and it needs a world-class workforce for maximum effectiveness. The government must acquire and retain top talent, especially in mission-critical occupations such as cybersecurity experts and economists. However, the current federal and pay benefits structure is really not conducive, in my opinion, to this goal. The general schedule, the pay schedule for the white-collar workers rewards tenure rather than performance, and the problem with this system is that it creates a twofold problem. One, taxpayers are stuck paying for overly generous compensation packages in comparison to private sector salaries for a comparable job. And two, the federal government is unable to adequately recruit and compensate top talent in other fields. Additionally, we need a federal retirement system that is responsive to the needs of a transient millennial workforce. And in an era when employees are highly mobile and can frequently change jobs, it makes no sense to have an archaic pension system that is designed for a workforce that stays in place for decades. Simply put, the current system is expensive and does not incentivize the best and brightest to join and stay in the federal workforce. According to the Office of Management and Budget, in fiscal year 2015, more than 2 million full-time equivalent non-postal individuals were employed in the executive branch. The cost to the federal government for these employees was nearly $256 billion in direct compensation and benefits. According to the Congressional Budget Office recently updated private sector compensation comparison report, federal employees earn 17% more in total compensation than a comparable private sector employee. The CBO analysis might not tell the entire story either. Other analysis conducted by the Heritage Foundation, which we'll hear from today, the American Enterprise Institute, additionally, who we'll hear from, found that federal employees are compensated at even greater rates than private sector workers. Interestingly, the CBO report found that compensation differs among higher workforce than with lower levels of education and lesser among those workers with advanced degrees. So we need to have a fiscally sustainable pay and benefit system that allows the federal government to reward performance and compensate others based on the importance of their position and not simply on tenure. I will want to make one other further comment. These hearings can many times be construed as taking one direction or another, and I have committed not only to my colleagues to my right to make sure that we get it right for the federal workforce. One of the most illuminating aspects that I've had is I've gone from workforce place to workforce place, some very large and some very small, that I was the first member of Congress to ever visit them. I've found that we have an incredibly dedicated federal workforce. So today I'd like to use this hearing to not only get at the facts, but also get an action plan where we can work in a bipartisan way to make sure that people are fairly compensated, but also to make sure that there's an incentive there to not only attract new federal workers, but also to make sure that the very thing that we're working for does not become a disincentive. What I've heard over and over and over again is that you have people who work very hard, and you have those who don't, and yet the compensation doesn't seem to be commensurate with that. And it has a chilling effect on those hard workers that I know Mr. Connolly and I, and certainly Mr. Cummings, both agree that we need to recognize great performance because we have some great federal workers. And with that, I'd now like to recognize the distinguished ranking member and my good friend, Mr. Cummings, for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As I listen to you, I could not help but think about the many federal employees who work so hard and have been committed, many of them, since they were children, to make things better for a wide range of people. I've often said that the people that I meet, the ones, many of them we see in the halls, the guard when we came in the garage, the researchers at NIH, the people who have given their blood, sweat, and tears at EPA to keep our water and our air clean. And I could go on and on and on. The ones that do the dirty jobs that nobody else will do. And at every instant that I have to speak to our employees, I tell them thank you. Today's hearing, we will review the compensation of federal workers compared to the compensations of workers in the private sector. The Congressional Budget Office recently issued a report on this topic, and it provides a lot of detailed information. Not surprisingly, the CBO report shows that some federal workers make more than their private sector colleagues, while others make less. Unfortunately, I fear that my Republican colleagues will try to use this report to argue that we are paying federal employees too much. Please. And then they may try to use this hearing as a basis to continue attacking the pay and benefits of federal workers. Since I've been in the Congress, one of the things that hurt me more than anything else is when the Congress was trying to deal with unemployment benefits. They said it had to be taken out of the purses of federal employees. I will never forget that. Hello? Unemployment benefits taken out of the purse of the federal employee. And this is exactly the wrong lesson to draw from this report. The real lesson for today's hearing is not that middle-class federal workers are making too much. It is that private sector workers, especially those with the lowest incomes and educations, are making too little. Over the past several decades, the productivity of American workers has grown higher than ever before. At the same time, corporations, shareholders, CEOs have been exploiting these workers and hoarding more and more of the wealth that these workers produce. And they do produce. From 1979 to 2013, the total income for the top 1% of households grew by an astonishing 188%. But over the exact same time frame, total income for the bottom 80% of households grew by a paltry 18%. Let's stick that in the DNA of every cell of our brains. It's not just wages that are stagnating. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that inequality in total compensation is worsening even more rapidly than wages alone. In other words, inequality is getting even worse when we take into account health insurance, retirement and savings plans, paid leave, and disability and life insurance. The other day I had breakfast with one of my constituents. And one of the things she said, that whenever you all are talking about health care, remember this. She said, when you're sick, you can't work. And if you can't work, you can't earn. And if you can't earn, you can't pay a policy. A lady suffering from stage 4 colon cancer, 26 years old, just married, wanted to have a baby, young lawyer, just passed the bar. So when we examine the lowest quarter wage earners, nearly 60% had no access to sick leave. Nearly 70% had no access to employer-provided medical care as of March 2016. Yet our friends on the other side of the aisle refuse to help these workers. And you're right, Mr. Chairman. We ought to applaud those who give their blood, their sweat, their tears. But no matter what office we go in, no matter where we go, there are going to be people that work real hard, and then there's going to be some that are going to work maybe just to get by. For years, they have refused to allow Congress to vote on Democratic legislation to raise the minimum wage. The minimum wage is only $7.25 per hour, and it has not been raised in 8 years. Try it. Try living on $7.25 an hour. At the same time, our Republican friends keep attacking federal workers. And I'm so glad that you, Mr. Meadows, Mr. Chairman, has been a constant, you kept a balance with regard to this, trying to look at both sides of it. And it's so important. It's so important because when I talk to federal workers, they watch these hearings and they say, well, why are we so demonized? We're just trying to do our job. And so they forced new federal employees to pay more for their retirement benefits in 2012 and 2013. And now they're threatening to take away their pensions. They want to follow the lead of private sector corporations in eliminating traditional defined benefit plans in exchange for less generous 401k style plans. And they cloak these cuts in the language of, quote, reform, unquote. The truth is that this will hurt their own constituents. This will hurt nearly 8,000 federal workers with only high school diplomas who live in Kentucky, 18,000 federal workers with high school diplomas in Georgia, and 31,000 federal workers with high school diplomas in Texas. We should be trying to lift up all workers, including both middle-class federal workers and low-income private sector workers. I hope that our witnesses today will shed some light on this. As I close with that, I would like to offer special thanks to Jacqueline Simon, of the Public Policy Director of the American Federation of Government Employees, and all of our witnesses. She agreed to testify at our request under extremely short notice, and we thank her tremendously for being here. Related to that, Mr. Chairman, I want to note my very strong objection to this committee's refusal to allow Senator Bernie Sanders to testify here today. I submitted my request for Senator Sanders to testify last week, and my request was denied for no reason other than certain Republicans on our committee claiming that Senator Sanders is not qualified to testify about challenges facing workers in our nation. Of course, that's ridiculous. Senator Sanders is a champion of workers' rights, and he is nationally renowned. He's a nationally renowned expert on these matters. This is not the first time the committee has refused to invite a witness we requested. Chairman Issa refused to request when we wanted to invite Sandra Fluke because he claimed she was not qualified to speak about the issues affecting women, such as birth control. However, this is the first time I can remember, and being on this committee in 21 years, that the committee tried to silence a United States senator who is also a former member of this esteemed committee. As a matter of fact, he used to sit right beside me. He certainly deserved more respect than he was given, and I extended my apologies to him. He had made arrangements to try to be here, and he said perhaps he will have another invitation at another time. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, point of personal privilege.
Hold on just a minute. The ranking member knows very well my personal feelings towards him. The ranking member also knows very well my personal feelings towards the federal workforce. And I expressed in no uncertain terms that this hearing would not be political. And Senator Sanders, in my opinion, representing less than 3,000 federal workers in his state, was not the best person to address this in a non-political way. And I shared that with you personally. I also wanted to, for the record, make it known that I offered other potential avenues for you to have people here. You were given 17 days' notice about this, and Senator Sanders brings a different element to a very important topic that we must fix on behalf of the federal workers. I don't believe you nor I want to sacrifice that for a political statement that potentially could be made based on a senator who represents less than 1%. In fact, not even that, 0.15% of the federal workforce in his state. And so my good friend needs to understand that when it comes to this, if we want to make a political statement, we can do that, and I'm doing my very best to make sure that what we do is we protect the federal workers. I know you and I agree on that. I know Jerry Conley and I agree on that. So let's make sure that we keep it where it is, and you know that I offered to have Steny Hoyer to come in because he represents a whole lot of other federal workers. And Jerry Conley comes to me each and every day on behalf of the federal workers. This is a Republican complimenting a Democrat on his advocacy for the federal workforce. You do the same. And here's what I want to say. Let's not make this political, and the denial for Bernie Sanders to come in here was one that was done in private between you and I. And so let's make sure that we keep the main thing the main thing.
Chairman, I just need 1 minute.
Sure.
You know, all of this is political. We are in a political climate. And
But it doesn't have to be.
No, I'm not finished.
It doesn't have to be.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for yielding. No, it does not have to be. But I think we set a dangerous precedent when we say to a United States senator, for the first time since I've been here, 21 years, that what he has to say, he can't say in this forum. Normally, I mean, we've had senators come and speak from both sides of the aisle. They come, they speak, we don't ask them questions, they move on. So, but I understand, and I appreciate. I want to make it clear, and I tried to say it, that you've been fair. Now, I tried to say it. Now, maybe I didn't say it as clear as you wanted me to say it, but all I was saying is I think sometimes we can set a precedent that is dangerous, and I don't know whether I'll ever get on the other side to get over to the Senate, but I would hope you all will welcome me back to talk about anything I want to talk about. I yield back.
We'll welcome you back. I don't know about talking on anything that you'd like to talk about. How about that?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
point of privilege, simply to correct what I think was a omission of some of the characteristics of a previous hearing, because I too, like you, Chairman, could not always allow every possible witness, but did make an effort to make sure that we never had a panel that was inappropriate to the balance. In the case of the particular hearing that the ranking member is referring to, they offered 2 witnesses. We had 2 panels. I had no problem with one witness, and I selected between the 2 they offered an ordained minister to be on a panel with other ordained ministers, priests, and rabbis. The ranking member refused that and demanded that a college student, not in any way a religious leader, testify on the first panel. I offered that she could testify on the second panel, which included other, if you will, lay people who were specialists. He refused. So it was always about who was appropriate for panel 1, which was priests, ministers, and rabbis, versus panel 2, which were other people knowledgeable on the area. And I think that it's important, just as you're doing here today, that each panel represent a common thread of knowledge, experience, and testimony. And so I applaud you for appropriately balancing your panel. It is interesting that when the shoe was on the other foot and I was in the minority, I was often denied even one witness. And I never made quite the claim that's being made here today, but I was unhappy. But I never denied an appropriate panel to the ranking member, and I hope in a full discussion he appreciates that.
Well, I thank the gentleman. I also want to say this. we're going to keep the main thing the main thing. And this is about the federal workforce and proper compensation. There are good and valuable inputs that can come from both sides of the aisle. And I hope the ranking member realizes that there is no one willing to listen more intently than me on this particular issue. It is important. As a business person, the best and most valuable asset you have is not a building, it's not a vehicle, it's not even a computer. It is the asset of your workforce and their contribution, and certainly our federal workforce. If you hear nothing else, if you're watching this, the asset of our federal workforce is one that should be applauded, rewarded appropriately based on merits and performance, and certainly, hopefully, this hearing will get here. So with that, I'll hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any members who would like to submit a written statement.
Mr. Chairman.
We'll now recognize,
Unanimous consent request simply, before you swear him in.
go ahead.
Yeah, I ask unanimous consent that the statements from the Senior Executive Association, National Treasury Employees Union, and the National Association of Active and Retired Federal Employees be entered into the record.
Without objection.
I thank my...
We will now recognize our panel of witnesses. I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Joseph Kyle, Assistant Director of Microeconomic Studies of the Congressional Budget Office. Welcome. Mr. Andrew Biggs, Resident Scholar of the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome. Ms. Rachel Gretzler, Research Fellow in Economics and Budget and Entitlements at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome. Mr. Robert Goldenkopf, Director of Strategic Issues at the Government Accountability Office. Welcome. And Ms. Jacqueline Simone, Policy Director of the American Federation of Government Employees of the AFL-CIO. Welcome. Welcome to you all. And pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify. So if you will please rise and raise your right hand. And I apologize, it's Ms. Simon. So, do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Please be seated. Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. In order to allow time for discussion, we would ask that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes, but your entire written statement will be made part of the record. So, Mr. Kyle, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify about CBO's recent report that compares the compensation of federal employees with those in the private sector. To provide some context for that comparison, my testimony focuses on the 2.2 million civilians who work for the federal government. Last year, the federal government spent $215 billion to compensate those people. CBO analyzed how the federal government's compensation costs would change if the average cost of employing federal workers was the same as that of the private sector. That's important because the government competes with the private sector for people who possess the mix of attributes needed to do its work. But a complete evaluation of the federal government's compensation system would require more information on recruitment and retention. Comparing compensation between the sectors is complicated because the workforces differ in characteristics that affect compensation, for instance, experience, education, and occupation. On the whole, federal workers tend to be older, more educated, and more concentrated in professional occupations than workers in the private sector. For instance, about 60% of federal employees have a bachelor's degree or more. By contrast, about 35% of private sector workers have that much education. CBO's analysis accounts for those differences and for other factors that we could observe. But compensation for individuals in both sectors also depends on factors that we could not observe. For instance, other traits such as motivation or effort are not easy to measure, but they can matter a great deal for compensation at the individual level. So our results are best interpreted as average differences between the sectors rather than an assessment of whether any individual would be paid more or less in the other sector. Turning to the results of our work, I want to focus on total compensation, that is the sum of wages and benefits. Between 2011 and 2015, the differences in total compensation of federal civilian employees with those of similar workers in the private sector varied widely depending on employees' educational attainment. Among workers with a high school diploma or less, total compensation costs were 53% more on average for federal employees than for their private sector counterparts. Among workers whose education culminated in a bachelor's degree, which is the most common level of education in the federal workforce, total compensation costs were 21% more for the federal workers than for workers in the private sector. By contrast, total compensation costs among workers with a professional degree or a doctorate were 18% less for federal employees than for workers in the private sector. Let me make a brief observation on both components of compensation. Focusing for a minute on wages, the ranges of wages between high and low-paid employees was narrower in the federal government than in the private sector. That narrower range of wages among federal employees might reflect constraints of the federal pay systems, which make it harder for managers to reward the best performers or to limit the pay of poor performers. Turning briefly to benefits, the most important factor in contributing to the difference between the two sectors is the defined benefit pension plan that is available to most federal employees. Such plans have become less common in the private sector. I'd like to close by touching briefly on the effects of two significant policy changes in recent years. First, lawmakers eliminated across-the-board salary increases for federal employees from 2011 to 2013. That limited the total increase during the period of our analysis to 2%. Because salaries in the private sector increased by more during that period, that change reduced the average wage of federal employees relative to the private sector. However, at the same time, the federal government also reduced hiring, and there was a temporary reduction in the number of hours worked by federal employees. Both of those factors had the effect of increasing the average compensation of federal workers relative to the private sector. The second policy change involved increasing the share of wages that federal employees who were hired after 2012 must contribute to federal defined benefit retirement plans. That change will gradually reduce the cost to the federal government of the program beginning this year. Thank you again for your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Kyle. Mr. Biggs, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Cummings, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity today to discuss how federal pay and benefits compare with what similar workers will be likely to receive in the private sector. The Congressional Budget Office has conducted a highly professional state-of-the-art analysis, which produces the headline figure that, on average, federal salaries and benefits are 17% above private sector levels. And that is a figure that deserves headlines. Total compensation per full-time equivalent federal employee in 2015 was about $123,000. A 17% federal pay premium implies that similar private sector workers would receive total pay and benefits of around $105,000, an annual difference of about $18,000. When averaged over 2.2 million federal employees, the federal compensation premium adds up to about $38 billion per year, equal to what the federal government spends on energy and the environment and substantially exceeding federal spending on transportation. One can have technical quibbles with the CBO's approach. My own view, again for technical reasons, is that the CBO somewhat underestimates the salary premium paid to federal employees, as well as underestimating the compensation paid to federal employees through their defined benefit pensions. My written testimony provides details on these technical disagreements. But to be clear, I doubt that any analyst would find the CBO's methods or results to be unreasonable. At this point, we should consider the technical debate over federal pay to be basically settled. Some federal workers may be underpaid relative to the private sector, but the vast majority are not. Some federal employees, particularly those with less education, receive far more in federal employment than they would likely receive outside of government. My own view is that across-the-board changes like wage freezes aren't the best approach. Instead, Congress and the administration should work to make federal agency pay setting more flexible to the needs of the labor market. If an agency finds that it cannot hire, it should be able to increase salaries. But the fact that the federal government receives so many applicants for each job opening, it has to cap the number of applicants it even considers, is evidence that most federal jobs are considered attractive relative to opportunities outside of government. The federal government should look to move away from the one-size-fits-all general schedule, which tries to equate dramatically different jobs onto a single pay scale. Other developed countries use more decentralized pay-setting approaches in which individual agencies are given more discretion to set pay for different jobs. Given the diverse range of occupations in the federal government, that seems an appropriate next step in ensuring that federal employees are paid fairly and efficiently. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs. And you've got a good namesake here in Congress from Arizona that shares your name. So, Ms. Gretzler, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'd like to focus my testimony on 3 different points. The first is differences in compensation that are not included in the CBO study or either of our studies here. The second is the government's faulty business model. And the third is some recommendations I have to bring federal compensation more in line with the private sector. So first, there are a lot of benefits that cannot be measured very easily or for which there's not significant data available or that might not be available to all workers equally across the board. So some of those benefits that are available to federal employees include significant student loan repayments, up to $10,000 per year or $60,000 in total, as well as student loan forgiveness after 10 years of on-time payments. Then there's up to $3,000 per year in federal transportation subsidies, as well as another $3,500 per year value of employees' retirement health benefits. Federal employees also have greater access to things like on-site childcare, and some can receive as much as $35,000 per year in childcare subsidies. And lastly, federal workers enjoy preferable work schedules and significantly greater job security. My second point is that the federal government's bad business structure hurts productivity and it unnecessarily drives up taxpayer costs. The government provides a big compensation premium. That should help the government function like a well-oiled machine. Instead, it's rusty and sluggish. One reason is that the government has a skewed compensation structure. It provides the biggest premium to the workers that it faces the least competition to attract, and it provides the smallest premium to those that it needs to entice the most. Compared to the private sector, the federal government employs almost 3 times as many workers with a master's degree or more, but only about 1/3 as many with a high school diploma or less. Another one of the government's bad business practices is that it overweights an undervalued benefit. Federal employees receive about 3 times as much in retirement benefits. Most of that comes from the government's defined benefit contribution plan. But workers don't fully value this pension plan because they don't know how much it will ultimately provide them in retirement, and oftentimes they need money in their paycheck more than they need a future promise for a benefit. A study of Illinois' public teachers found that they valued additional pension benefits at only 19 cents on the dollar. It makes no sense for the federal government to provide a benefit that is worth only a fraction of the cost to its employees. And lastly, the government stifles productivity by failing to reward high performers and also failing to penalize low performers. Federal workers receive 2 effectively automatic pay increases. The first is an annual cost of living adjustment, and then second, 99.9% of all federal employees receive a so-called performance-based pay increase. While virtually all federal employees receive these performance-based pay increases, almost none are penalized or fired. According to a study by the OPM, 80% of all federal managers have managed a poorly performing employee. Yet, fewer than 15% have rated those poor performing employees anything less than fully successful. And fewer than 8% of them attempted to do anything about it. Among those who did attempt to take action, 78% said that their efforts had no effect. This is a recipe for driving out the most productive employees and retaining the least productive ones. That is the opposite of what business schools teach and what private and successful businesses practice. So finally, I'd like to propose a few changes to bring federal employee compensation more in line with that of the private sector. This should help improve productivity, accountability, and efficiency. First, Congress should make dismissing federal employees less difficult by extending the probationary period from 1 year to 3 years, by limiting dismissal appeals, by lowering the burden of proof necessary to fire federal workers, and by expediting the dismissal process for certain employees. Next, Congress should reduce the level of within-grade pay increases that cause federal employees to climb the pay scale more quickly than those in the private sector. Some of those savings should go towards truly performance-based pay increases. Employees who don't receive performance-based pay increases should have limited options for appeal, and federal managers should not have to institute a performance improvement plan for employees that it rates anything less than fully successful. Finally, the biggest change that can be made is in the defined benefit contributions to the pensions. This could actually be a win-win for taxpayers and for federal employees. As I propose it, workers would have options as to the type of plan. They would not be kicked out of their defined benefit pensions. They wouldn't lose anything that they've already accrued, and less of their total compensation could be tied up in future benefits. This would give workers actual dollar contributions that they own and control, and it would force the federal government to recognize the costs that it promises immediately instead of passing them on to future taxpayers. Other changes would include reducing the amount of paid leave from roughly 43 days to 35, as well as limiting the retiree health benefit to current employees. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Mr. Goldenkoff, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee. I am pleased to be here today to discuss the federal employee compensation system and ways to modernize it. Currently, federal employees are compensated through an outmoded system that, 1, rewards length of service rather than individual performance and contributions, and 2, automatically provides across-the-board annual pay increases even to poor performers. At the same time, skills gaps in mission-critical occupations across government are putting agencies and programs at risk, while high levels of employees eligible for retirement create both challenges and opportunities for agencies to transform their organizations to better meet mission requirements and also address budgetary pressures. These trends point to the fact that a careful consideration of federal pay is necessary for both sound fiscal stewardship as well as to support the cost-effective recruitment and retention of a high-performing and agile federal workforce. In my remarks today, I will discuss key lessons learned in creating a more market-driven, results-oriented approach to federal pay, and opportunities in addition to federal pay that OPM and agencies could leverage to be more competitive in the labor market. The bottom line is that while the federal compensation may need to be re-examined, agencies must also make better use of the tools and flexibilities already available to them. Congressional policy calls for federal workers' pay under the general schedule to be aligned with comparable non-federal workers' pay. But while implementing a more market-based and performance-oriented pay system is both doable and desirable, it certainly won't be easy. The experiences of public, private, and nonprofit organizations in rolling out their own results-oriented pay systems provide useful lessons learned for the federal government. Among other things, they told us that it was important to examine the value of employees' total compensation to remain competitive in the labor market, provide training on leadership, management, coaching, and feedback to facilitate effective communication and to link individual performance to organizational results, and third, build meaningful stakeholder consensus to gain ownership and acceptance for any pay reforms. In addition to competitive compensation, high-performing organizations have found that the full life cycle of personnel management activities, including workforce planning, recruitment, onboarding, engagement, and training, need to be fully aligned and focused on the cost-effective achievement of an organization's mission. In many instances, improvements in these areas are within the control of federal agencies. Among other things, our work has shown that the tone starts from the top. Agency leaders and managers should set an example that human capital management is directly linked to performance and that it is not simply a transactional function. Moreover, Time and again, our work has shown how a breakdown in one or more personnel functions can erode the performance of federal agencies and threaten their ability to cost-effectively carry out their missions. Going forward, key focus areas for OPM and agencies include improving the hiring process by, among other actions, refining, consolidating, or eliminating less effective hiring authorities, modernizing the classification system so that it keeps pace with the government's evolving requirements, and strengthening performance management and agencies' ability to deal with poor performers through such steps as lengthening the probationary period. Opportunities also exist to improve the capacity of agency human resource offices to better support an agency's requirements. In conclusion, federal compensation should enable agencies to cost-effectively attract, motivate, and retain a high-performing and agile workforce necessary to meet their missions. At the same time, our work has also shown that agencies already have a number of tools and flexibilities available to them that can significantly improve executive branch personnel management. Going forward, it will be important to hold agencies accountable for fully leveraging those resources. Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Cummings, this completes my prepared statement, and I'll be pleased to respond to any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Ms. Simon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The CBO study answers a very peculiar question. How much could the government save if it paid its workforce the average of what private employers pay, broken down by demographic criteria? It's a strange question. It's more the kind of thing that might be asked on a graduate school midterm in labor economics, but only to find out whether the students get the idea behind human capital theory. The human capital approach CBO takes is basically a capital asset pricing model that applies the logic of finance to human beings. Wages, salaries, and benefits are the price, and workers are the asset. The asset's attributes are the race, sex, education, industry, and whatever else might be a source of value. When you compare the compensation the government provides to averages in the private sector measured through a human capital lens, you find the government both overpays and underpays depending on demographics. Not surprising, because the government employs people to work in an enormous range of jobs. The human capital approach has been used successfully to show how jobs that mainly employ women and racial minorities pay less than jobs that mainly employ white men, even though the jobs require similar levels of education. But here we are using the human capital approach to complain about pay and benefit systems that do not discriminate. When CBO assessed the accuracy of the capital asset pricing of the conglomeration of human capital known as the federal workforce, it was clear they'd find the price too high. This is because, on average, the private sector pays men more than women, whites more than blacks, old more than young. The federal government does not reproduce all these inequities because in its pay systems, demographic traits are irrelevant. Federal pay is an attribute of the job, not the traits of the individual holding the job. As a result, men and women with the same federal job are paid roughly the same amount. The demographic traits that comprise a human capital model's independent variables are completely irrelevant to the salary and benefit package the federal government applies to any given federal job. Had CBO used the proper method for making the comparison, the one used by the Federal Salary Council, its conclusions would have lined up with the Council's findings, that federal employees are underpaid, whether they're top professionals like doctors and lawyers, technical experts like engineers and scientists, healthcare providers like VA nursing assistants and dietitians, or administrative workers who handle claims for Social Security or veterans benefits. My written statement describes the inappropriateness of the human capital approach for comparison of non-cash compensation. Here I will focus on the failures of the CBO study with regard to retirement costs. The federal government finances its employees' retirement benefits by setting aside funds in the Civil Service Retirement and Disability Fund, CSRDF. All agency and employee contributions are assigned to this trust fund, and its assets are invested exclusively in U.S. Treasury bonds. These bonds are budget authority and thus can be redeemed to pay earned annuities to federal retirees. The rate of return on these assets, on the assets of the fund, is just like the Social Security Trust Fund, a combination of all the interest rates of the Treasury bonds held by the fund. Historically, the rate of return on Treasury bonds has been lower than the rate of return on private equities. Private sector and some state and local governments are free to invest the assets of their pension plans in a mix of public and private equities. Because the law prohibits the government from investing the trust fund's assets in any form of equity other than treasuries, it costs more to produce each dollar of federal retirement benefit. The federal government must spend more for each employee's benefit, regardless of the employee's salary, education, race, age, or occupation. CBO's updated report makes no useful contribution to the discussion on federal pay and benefits. Frankly, its implications are horrid. If the government were to compensate its employees so that its costs reflected average private sector costs by demographics, it would reproduce all the inequities we deplore in the private sector. Compensation for women and racial minorities would decline immensely. Regardless of the relative complexity, difficulty, and responsibilities of different jobs, what would matter would simply be the educational attainment of the person doing the job. A bachelor's degree from Trump University would merit the same rate of return as a bachelor's degree from Duke or Chapel Hill. The salary of a Border Patrol agent whose job requires only a high school diploma would have to match the abysmal pay of retail workers whose jobs also only require a high school diploma. The federal government should be proud of its pay system. Few in the private sector can match its fairness and internal equity. Its principle of market comparability and its authority for managers to reward high performers and punish poor performance are more than adequate. All that's missing is funding. The government should never adopt any kind of pay system that allows discrimination on the basis of demographics. Market comparability, adherence to the merit system principles of equal pay for substantially equal work, and fairness must continue to be the principles on which federal pay is based. Thank you.
I thank you for your testimony. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goldenkoff, I'm looking at a chart. There's some graphs from your 2016 Federal Employees Performance Rating Report, and it's a pie chart. Pie graph, I should say, says 38.8% of federal employees were fully successful, 27.4% were exceeded fully successful, and 33.1% were outstanding. It said only 0.1% of all federal employees were unacceptable performance. You familiar with this chart, this pie chart?
Sure. It's sort of the Lake Wobegon approach to performance management, where everybody is strong and above average.
Not everybody. Well, yeah, you're right, everybody. 99.9% of all federal employees got, I mean, if you think about back in school, looks like, you know, got an A minus, an A, or an A plus. I mean, I've never seen a classroom like that ever.
Exactly, and we have said that that is problematic and certainly inconsistent with some leading practices on performance management that we have developed. One of them is making meaningful distinctions in performance. And I think, you know, the root cause of this and what's so important is that, you know, you could make it easier to fire poor performers, and obviously there needs to be some improvements there, but on the front end, the performance management process needs to be improved. Supervisors need to do their jobs, for one thing. They need to be able to realistically rate employees based on their performance.
Yeah, I'm just looking from the practical constituent kind of perspective that I would think the good folks in the 4th District of Ohio would look at it. If you got 99.9% of the workforce getting an A, I think our constituents want to know why they have to wait 8 weeks to get their passport, or why when they call the IRS, only 30% ever got to talk to a actual person when they called into the call center. I mean, if we got the greatest workforce in history, you would think the taxpayers would get a little better treatment than they do. Let me turn to Ms. Gressler. Ms. Gressler, is it true that, so if I got the gist of what you guys said, overall pay for federal employees is higher than that in the private sector? Is that accurate?
Yes.
Significantly higher, like 17%. Wasn't that what someone said, one of the studies, your study?
CBO compensation was 17%
17%
total. I believe
higher.
we found about a 22% just for the pay component. We found about 30 to 40% for total compensation.
So they get paid better. Are their benefits better for the folks who work in the federal government?
The benefits are the significant part of the compensation bonus. Yes.
Right,
A lot
so-
of that's the health care and the pensions.
Yeah, so they get cheaper health insurance than the average American gets.
And significantly greater pension benefits.
Get paid better, better pension, cheaper health care, better overall benefit package, sick leave, all those kind of things, right? And you can't fire them, right?
Yes.
And 99.1% of them get an A minus, an A, or an A plus
Yep.
in their performance. Wow, that's amazing.
Well, and that's
yet-
one of the reasons that you see the quit rate among federal employees is 1/5 that from the private sector.
Yeah.
Once they're in there, they're not going to leave.
Well, yeah, you can't blame it for that, I guess, but this is just, just phenomenal for me to think. And then to add insult to injury, all that, better pay, better benefits, better and cheaper health insurance. They can't get fired. My guess is the reason you got 99.9% getting these successful more than fully successful in these ratings is because that allows them to jump up and pay quicker, right?
That's the biggest thing we found is that moving up those with those effectively
need that.
automatic pay increases, they move up more quickly.
Exactly. And all that's going on, and at the same time, you had the agency I like to cite from time to time, the IRS, which, again, targeted people. I mean, so the folks like Lois Lerner were getting all this and targeting Americans exercising their First Amendment liberties. And just on a practical side, people calling in, trying to get customer service, trying to get answers to their questions during tax season, only a third of them can even talk to a real person. Yeah.
And I would just add that for federal employees, yes, they have a big compensation premium, but they're not all just sitting there happy and taking in this premium. I think a lot of them are really frustrated with the structure because
Sure.
it's not rewarding those good performers. And because it's so difficult for federal managers to get rid of a poor performer or to even demote them or do anything to improve their performance, those people sit there and it's the high performers that are having to do their job. You know, they're doing the work of two people to make up for that fact, and they're not rewarded for it.
Yep. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This committee has a long and strong history of really delving into some of the most important issues facing the American people. And it just mystifies me that we have chosen this topic. You know, we could be investigating, the Russian interference in the Democratic elections. We could be investigating whether the FBI director was fired because he actively was investigating that Russian connection. We could be investigating whether the president asked the former FBI director for a pledge of loyalty a few weeks back. Or we could have looked at whether the president specifically asked the former FBI director to quash the investigation of the former NSA advisor, Mr. Flynn. So rather than keeping the politics out of this committee, I think the leadership of this committee is actually suppressing a lot of the important issues that really should, and in history, have been grappled with by this committee. Instead, we're trying to figure out why the federal employees, the ones with a bachelor's degree, are getting paid less than their counterparts in the private sector, and why the lowest paid federal employees are being paid a little bit more than their counterparts in the private sector. I think we've got misplaced priorities, we really do, in this committee. I think there's a hell of a lot more we could be doing about issues that are real. Now, I know this hearing comes up once every year, basically, or once every 2 years, to look at the wages of federal employees. But what I've got from the testimony so far is that federal employees are treated better because they get tuition reimbursement. But as far as the federal government as an employer, we should be doing that. We should be encouraging private sector to provide tuition reimbursement so we can educate our workers. That's a good thing. They get child care. That's an advantage that some federal employees have. They have a child care facility right in the building. And that's a good thing. But we're being told you should take that away so that they would be more like the private sector. oh, you should take the tuition reimbursement away because that would make them more like the private sector and close that gap. Or they have flexible hours. We can't have people have flexible hours. So take those flexible hours and make those federal employees more like the private sector. Or take away their pensions. So let me get this straight. We've got a pension crisis. We have a retirement crisis in this country because everyone's on a 401k. And after working for 30 years or 35 years, at the end of their working lives, they don't have enough money in their retirement to have a decent living, so they go on the federal, they go on federal benefits. And they have the taxpayer have to support them because they have to have Meals on Wheels. They have to have all kinds of subsidies because they weren't allowed to accrue enough benefits in their retirement plan during their working lives that they have to rely on government. They qualify for government benefits. So we're supposed to make federal employees more like that. Take away their pensions, and just give them 401ks, so at the end of their lives, they won't have enough money to retire with dignity, and they can go on government benefits, and we'll pay them that way. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous. And the COLAs that we give people have been pitiful. Wages are flat in this country. So with all we got going on, with everything we got going on at the White House, we're focusing on this. You've got to be kidding me. So I got docs at the VA that are making about 75% what they could be making in the private sector. I got nurses at the VA that have way too many patients, and they're making about 60% what they could be making at a private hospital. I got therapists at the VA that have way too many patients, and they're making about half of what they would be making if they went over to the Mass General or Tufts or one of the private hospitals in my district. And so we're going after these people. I think our priorities are misplaced, Mr. Chairman, and I thank him for his indulgence, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. I would remind the gentleman on some of those issues, he and I are not apart.
No, let me just say, make that clear. I have worked with the chairman on many, many issues, and we are in harmony with much of what I just said. I yield back. Thank you.
All right, I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make a couple of points about wage stagnation, since our colleagues have brought that up. Wage stagnation has, there are many causes for that, and I'd like to point out the National Small Business Association's annual survey of their members. Employers reported the average cost of their monthly health insurance premiums per employee increased from $590 in 2009 prior to the Affordable Care Act to $1,121 in 2014. And I'd like to point out that's before the major increase in premiums that we've seen the last year or so. And in addition to that, they paid out another $458 a month just in other health care related costs per employee. So when you're spending that kind of money on increases in health insurance premiums and health care costs, it will necessarily reduce the amount that you have to pay in wages, and it still is compensation. The other thing I want to point out is the American Action Forum, which tracks the cost of regulation, reported that the Obama administration levied $181.5 billion in regulatory cost just in 2014. That's $692 per capita for each American, which drives down people's spending power. And that's a hidden cost. Ms. Gessler, get back to the topic. By the way, if we want to have a discussion about stolen elections, I think it would be appropriate to bring Senator Sanders in. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What would shifting to a defined contribution retirement system look like for federal employees, federal government workers, Ms. Gessler?
So the way that I have envisioned it is anybody with 25 years or more of service would be grandfathered into the current system. Nothing's going to change for them. For all new hires or anybody that has fewer than 5 years of service, those people who have not yet become vested in their pensions, they'd be shifted to defined contribution system, just playing on the existing thrift savings plan that federal employees already have. And so the contribution to that for the government, currently it's between 1% and 5%. That would increase to between 4% and 8%. Existing federal employees with between 5 and 25 years of service would have 3 different choices. They can do the same thing that the new hires are doing, and they can shift entirely to that defined contribution system with a much higher match and overall contribution. And they can choose to take essentially a lump sum benefit. Everything that they've accrued in their pension, they take that value, and it goes into their thrift savings plan. Alternatively, they could choose to basically freeze their defined benefit pension as it is. They keep everything that is accrued. They'll still have a defined benefit pension in retirement, but going forward, they're in that new system, and they have the higher contribution to their thrift savings plan. Or they can stay in the existing system, can keep the same level of defined benefit, but there will be some changes going forward only. Nothing taken away, because this was part of their compensation, and I would never argue that we should take away something that was really a past. It was essentially in their paychecks. So we don't take that away, but going forward, they would probably pay a little bit higher percentage of their overall contribution. The retirement age may increase, and some other small changes along those lines.
Can you give me a fairly brief answer on what kind of cost savings we could expect from making those changes?
Well, the pensions is the biggest component. Adding in everything all together, we've estimated $330 billion over 10 years.
Mr. Kyle or Mr. Biggs, one of you, if you could answer this, do you have any way to measure productivity in the federal workforce as you would, say, in the private sector? I mean, when you have 99-point-something% of people who are excellent, wouldn't that indicate that productivity is off the charts?
It is difficult. When I was at the Social Security Administration, we made efforts to measure productivity, but it tended to be a measure of outputs, a number of cases handled. A true measure of productivity measures the cost of inputs, the labor cost, the compensation cost, in order to then figure out the improvement of the output. So I don't think the federal government does a particularly good job of measuring productivity, although I will say it is not an easy thing.
Can you answer it in the context of the point Mr. Jordan made about they were only responding to 30% of the calls? I think that was the number he gave. Wouldn't that indicate a productivity problem?
What you want to know is how productivity grows over time and how many calls they're getting in. It's not a straightforward thing to answer. And I'll admit I don't know the IRS very well, so I don't want to act as if I know more than I do.
All right. Mr. Kyle, last question. What effect does the outdated nature of the current GS schedule have on hiring?
So that's actually one of the things that we would like to know more about. We don't have a very good sense of the data on hiring and retention and recruitment, and I think that in understanding both the current compensation system and others that might take its place, we would need to look further into that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I want to concentrate a little bit on the issue of benefits, particularly health care benefits. An article published in the New York Times last year found, and I quote, "The first full year of the Affordable Care Act brought historic increases in coverage for low-wage workers and others who have long been left out of the health care system." The New York Times also found, and I quote, "Part-time workers gained insurance at a higher rate than full-time workers, and people with high school degrees gained it at a double the rate of college graduates." Unfortunately, Republicans now want to take away health care from the most vulnerable citizens, including working Americans who gain health care thanks to the Affordable Care Act. And the latest Trump Care bill would do just that. Mr. Kyle, House Republicans forced the revised Trump Care bill through the House before the CBO could even come up with a score. However, CBO's score of Trump Care as it was first introduced found that under that bill, and I quote, "In 2018 by CBO and JCT estimates, about 14 million more people would be uninsured relative to the number under current law. That increase would consist of about 6 million fewer people with coverage obtained in the non-group market, roughly 5 million fewer people with coverage under Medicaid, and 2 million fewer people with employer-based coverage. I know you didn't work on the score, but am I understanding this correctly? In addition to ripping away health care from the millions of people who buy coverage in their individual market and rely on Medicaid, that the Trump Care bill, as originally proposed, would also reduce the number of working Americans who get their health care through their employers by 2 million by 2018. Yes or no?
Congresswoman, I'm afraid that you've left my area of expertise. I'd have to refer you back to both CBO's cost estimate of that bill and my colleagues back at the office.
Good thing we have a record of it. CBO also found that the number of people obtaining health care through their employers would fall by, and I quote, roughly $7 million by 2026. And some of this reduction in employer-based health coverage in the U.S. would occur because employers would simply stop offering health care insurance. Trump Care also reduces the amount of tax credits people will receive to help them pay for insurance. So in addition to losing their employer-provided health care, these workers may be left with less financial support to purchase insurance on their own. Finally, I think it's important to keep in mind that repealing the ACA would harm all Americans, including those who get insurance through their employers, by doing away with important consumer protections like no annual and lifetime limits on benefits, free preventive care, and out-of-pocket spending limits. Ms. Simon, is it true that all workers have benefited from the Affordable Care Act?
I believe the answer is yes, but I can really only talk about federal employees and the Federal Employees Health Benefits Program. Immediately, the Federal Employee Health Benefits Program adopted all the benefits of Obamacare that you've just listed and others, including coverage of children up to age 26, the essential benefits package, and lifetime maximums, and the requirement that ultimately limited the profits that insurance companies can take from premium payments.
Well,
so federal employees certainly benefited.
Thank you, and certainly federal employees seem to be the target of this discussion today, and I believe that this proposal that we're under right now is both harmful to them as well as to employees in the private sector. I think it's also important to note that we should be creating good jobs. We should be encouraging better distribution of all of the sort of revenue that streams through private sectors. We should be concerned that lower wage workers who are working out in the private sector are getting a livable wage. We should be concerned that in this country that we have a minimum wage that is a living workable wage. We should not be looking to dummy down. We should be looking to elevate. And we should also look to the fact that those who represent the very wealthiest and the smallest percentage of people in this country have had no problem with their revenue streams increasing exponentially. And the difference between what a worker gets paid, a good educated worker, an uneducated worker, and a CEO is just un-American. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman. Ms. Simon, I want to make sure that you can hopefully clarify. You didn't mean to say that everybody benefited from the Affordable Care Act. I think that's what you told her, but I wouldn't think that you actually meant that, did you?
I believe I did mean that, and that's how I understood her question.
So your recommendation then would be that we ought to move all federal workers into the Affordable Care Act?
That was not my recommendation. I answered
But
the
if everybody
broad question.
benefits, wouldn't it be best that everybody's on it?
Obamacare, the law that established what we now call Obamacare.
I'm going to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, because he's next. But I'll come back to that. I'll give you some time to think about it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And yes, I would say the previous questioning was totally misguided, realizing that federal workers are not on Obamacare, while the rest of the Americans have been forced on that. The Federal Employees Health Benefit Program is quite a bit different, and we can't compare that at all. I want to shift gears, Mr. Kyle. I want to come over to you. I'm sure you're familiar with official time, which enables federal employee union members to be hired by whatever agency they may be hired for, but instead of doing the work they were hired to do, they work for the union in multiple ranges, some 100% and some quite a bit less. My question to begin with is, did the CBO analysis take official time into consideration?
So we didn't measure that specifically. Our data was from what's known as the Current Population Survey. And,
Okay, why not? Why was official time not considered?
and those data on those types of activities are not available in that data set.
Okay, so not available because of reporting problems or what?
It's a measurement issue, yes.
Okay, so, well, bringing that up, our friend Mr. Ross is not here, but he has a bill that would, that in fact, hopefully we're going to be voting on this relatively soon, perhaps even next week, H.R. 1293, that would require some reporting of official time. Are you familiar with that legislation?
I'm not, Congressman.
Okay, 1293, it'd be worth getting familiar with that. If we have proper reporting requirements for those on official time, if that were available, would that change the CBO's analysis in looking at it?
I don't know. We would have to do that analysis in order to get an answer to that question.
Okay, well, according to CBO's own described definition of official time, it is, quote, paid time off from assigned government duties to represent a labor union. Now, that's the CBO's definition. So how can paid time off not be considered compensation?
The time off is a measure of the benefits that we provide in our analysis.
A paid time off is, but not when it relates to official time, which many federal employees are using 100% of the time.
And what we're measuring or what we're taking is what's in the data, hours worked, and in that data they don't report the activities that they were doing when they were working.
Okay, well, I'm not worried about the activities. The fact is, though, if they're using official time, if official time is not considered compensation, what is it considered?
Official time would be considered compensation.
Okay, but it's not analyzed in because of reporting issues.
Well, what we don't have is the breakdown of the employees report the hours that they work, the number of hours that they work. They don't report what they were doing.
That is official time. Okay, well, hopefully we're going to be able to get that corrected. And I look forward to, I have a bill myself, H.R. 1364, that would prohibit federal employees who are using 80% or more of their time on official time in any given year, that they would not, that year would not be counted as credible service for retirement benefits at 80% or more. I would appreciate you looking at that. And I look forward to CBO including official time future compensation studies as part of the analysis. I think all of this is skewed if we're not taking this into consideration. Mr. Biggs, let me come to you real quickly. It's come up multiple times already, the problem with firing federal employees, bad actors in this thing. They have multiple avenues of appeal all through the process. There's no way this cannot be considered a job security benefit. Is that correct?
Oh, that's correct. If you look at surveys of employees done by human resources consultants, pay, benefits, and job security are the three most important things.
And if you can't fire someone, that's pretty good job security. Or if you make it so difficult that it literally is an act of Congress to fire someone, that's pretty significant job security.
Sure, and there's two components to it. One is it's very unusual for a federal employee to be fired for cause. The second is it's very unusual for there to be layoffs. So you can look at unemployment rates for federal government employees. They're probably half those of similarly educated and experienced private sector workers.
Okay,
so that's a benefit that's not included in this sort of analysis.
Besides lengthening the probationary period, what else can be done to address this problem?
Well, there's a variety of things. One is, as Mr. Goldenkopf said, of encouraging federal managers to use the powers that they already have, to not be afraid to use what rights they do have. I think it's also in terms of, employees deserve due process, but due process should not be so lengthy and costly that it is cheaper to keep on an employee who is not performing than it is to try to fire them. And this is a problem you find throughout the public sector. It is not worth the time and the money and the effort to fire an underperformer. Rather, you simply move them aside so that they're not an impediment to the vast majority of workers who are doing a good job. But it is the private sector manages to do this. Private sector firms don't want to fire good performers. They don't want to scare their workforce. So I think there's reason the federal government can do this, and it's really a question of putting in the effort and really being dedicated to it.
Thank you. I wish we had time to hear from each of you on this, but I appreciate your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Mr. Chairman, I seek a right of personal privilege.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I just want to I sort of acknowledge my colleague's comments regarding my line of questioning, that I have to question his ability to question my line of questioning because he cannot determine for me what is or what is not relevant. But to discuss the issues
The
of
gentlewoman will
salaries,
state, the gentlewoman will state her point of personal privilege.
This is my point of personal privilege. My point of personal privilege is that the discussion of this ill-advised Trump Care healthcare initiative, as it represents a component of benefits to both employees in federal government and outside of federal government, is a line of questioning that is worthy of pursuing. And that if my colleagues just feel a need to be able to run away from that whole issue, that ill-conceived Trump Care bill, I can certainly understand it.
Okay,
but I shan't accept anyone's characterization
Okay, the chair
of the
will.
appropriateness of my questions.
the
Thank you. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair will remind all members on both sides that they are to keep personalities out of their line of questioning. They're to direct their questions to the witnesses without personalities involved. Gentleman is Ms. Plaskett from the Virgin Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I think it's interesting, Mr. Biggs, that you, the notion that job stability is a benefit seems to be a very anti-American notion, that you're counting as a benefit of a job the fact that someone has the job and is assured of a job, when we as Americans are trying to keep our economy stable so that all people can be assured of work. That seems to me a very unusual position for you to be equating and wrapping into data analysis of job benefits.
If you can literally go back to Adam Smith, who was the first.
Yes, know who he is.
The founder
economics.
of economics. And what he noted is that certain jobs will have more stability than other jobs. And what he noted then is that jobs that have less stability to them will pay a premium to the worker to compensate them for that risk. You find the same thing, jobs that are more dangerous or more unpleasant pay a compensating differential for that risk. So, and there is research showing that jobs that are in the private sector that are more secure, that have less risk of being fired or laid off, will pay slightly less than jobs that have more of that risk. It's a compensating payment for that risk.
I don't know if steel workers would necessarily agree with that, with the amount of pay that they've received, or cotton pickers would agree that that was baked into the analysis of the
The way I would
were
respond to
getting.
you is, if you were looking.
I don't need you to respond,
Okay,
but thank you.
then-
Mr. Kyle, CBO recently found that on average, federal employees receive more generous benefits than private sector workers. Your analysis showed that the cost of benefits provided to federal workers was 47% higher than the cost of benefits provided to private sector workers, and benefits for federal employees with no more than a high school education were 93% higher than for similarly educated workers in the private sector. Is that correct?
Yes.
And CBO also found that the higher cost of the benefits federal workers receive compared to the benefits private sector workers receive can be attributed mostly to the differences in retirement benefits. Was that how the analysis went?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Your report states that federal government provides both defined benefits and defined contribution plans to its employees. And it's my understanding that a defined benefit plan is like a traditional benefit plan, and a defined contribution plan is more similar to a 401k, or in the case of federal employees, the thrift savings plan. Do I have that right?
Yes.
All right. In contrast to the federal government, in the private sector, employees no longer offer defined benefit plans or pensions. They've been replaced primarily with 401k plans?
Primarily, there are still some places that offer defined benefit plans, but they're
Is that percentage
I don't-
significant?
I don't have that number in front of me.
Okay. It's my concern and fear of many of us that many of my colleagues, my Republican colleagues, will be using CBO's report in this hearing to justify eliminating pensions for federal employees. I know that our Chairman Chaffetz has said in the past that he wants to get rid of federal pensions by shifting to a 401k type plan for new employees in the federal government. We hear or have information that retirement experts have warned that the vast majority of Americans are not saving enough for such a savings plan. Mr. Simon, do you agree that the Economic Policy Institute's findings, which state that the shift from pensions to account-type savings plans have been a disaster for lower income, Black, Hispanic, non-college educated, and single workers who together add up to the majority of American population? But even among upper-income white college-educated married couples, many do not have adequate retirement savings. What is your feelings about that conclusion?
I think it's entirely accurate and it's warranted. The most recent data I've seen is that less than half of all private sector workers are covered by any kind of employer-sponsored pension plan or retirement plan at all. And among those who have some kind of a 401k type savings plan as part of their employment, get no employer match or no employer contribution at all to their 401k. So, of course, this is a horrible retirement crisis in the making, as Representative Lynch was describing earlier. At the same time that private employers have abandoned providing any kind of financial subsidy for their employees' retirement, wages and salaries have stagnated for the vast majority of workers, bottom 80% of the income stream. So absolutely, the EPI's findings are accurate and
concerning to you as an organization and to the federal employees.
Absolutely.
Thank you, and with that, I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentlewoman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I did get to hear your opening statement and the opening statement of the ranking member, but I had some other meetings I had to go to, so I apologize if I get into an area that has already been covered. But I will say this, I agree with the chairman and the ranking member and others that we have many good, dedicated, wonderful federal employees. I will say, though, that I saw a statistic not long ago that said 58% of the people in this world have to get by on $4 or less a day. We've got hundreds of millions who would like to come here and get minimum wage jobs, so all of us are very blessed to live in this country. And I was asked by a school group last year one time, did I like my job? And I said, yes, I've always felt very lucky to have my job. And I said, I'd read a brief Bible study the day before that said, if you don't feel very lucky to have your job, just think how you would feel if you were fired that day. And so what I see is sort of unfortunate. Almost everybody wants to make themselves to be some kind of victim today. And so I've heard and seen articles about the low morale of federal employees and so forth and how tough they have it. Yet compared to the great majority of the people, they have it, they're pretty well off. So let me ask you this, though. We have some stuff in the briefing material that says there are too many appeal options. And I noticed that Mr. Heiss had just, I think, gotten into that about maybe it being too difficult to get rid of a bad employee. It says too many appeal options lead to unearned pay increases and poor performer retention. What is that accurate? Do you think? Anybody have a comment about that? Do you think we have too many appeal options and that does lead to some unfairness?
I'd like to answer that
Yes,
question.
ma'am. Go ahead.
I think that there are numerous ways that federal managers can get rid of poor performers or employees who engage in misconduct. The GAO, OPM, the MSPB have all done very comprehensive studies of those questions and found that it is not legal authority that's lacking, it's willingness to take on the responsibility that federal managers have to their agencies, to taxpayers, to document evidence and make sure that people who that the allegations of poor performance or misconduct are valid. That's all that's required. If we don't have the protections as taxpayers to know that our federal agencies are being staffed by people who have their jobs on the basis of their objective qualifications rather than their political affiliation or any other kind of non-merit factor, then we'll have a corrupt government. These protections that federal managers whine and complain about actually protect the public from corrupt government, from agencies hiring people
Well, before I run out of time, let me ask you this: does anybody know what can anybody tell me what percentage of federal employees are fired or removed in any one year, Ms. Griesler?
Yes, I believe it's 0.3%.
0.3%.
Or fired.
How many? What percentage federal employees leave each year to go into the private sector? Do we know that figure?
I don't know that one. I would add, though, on here that a big impediment here is the performance improvement plan process. And yes, I recognize that managers are choosing not to follow a lot of these procedures that they would need to do in order to fire or even to demote or rate an employee less than fully successful. They're choosing out of experience. I've had federal managers call me and say, yes, there's some avenues we can do here, but the legal hurdles are so high, such a high burden of proof. On average, it takes 1.5 years to fire a federal employee. Now, if you're running a private business, that's absurd to have an employee there that is a poor performer or actually sometimes impeding the mission of the organization or harming it, and yet you can't get rid of them for 1.5 years. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Let me go in one more
That is
direction.
not true.
My time's up, but just let me ask this. I've heard for years that federal agencies spend 60% of their money in the first 11 months, and they scramble around and try to spend the rest of it so that their budgets won't be cut. Do you think that, in fact, I've introduced a bill to give bonuses to federal employees if their department or their agency saves money, where we would split half the money for bonuses and half the money would go back to towards the deficit. Does anybody have an opinion as to that type of a bill similar to that? Would you think that would be feasible or would work?
I think that you definitely need greater ability and greater performance-based budgets to factor in there. The one thing you just want to be careful of is there going to be a push for those managers to get a higher budget next year so that they can then use some of that towards the performance-based bonuses.
Well,
but certainly they do need more.
The problem is that people get paid the same where they work hard or where they work easy. So you need to have some incentives or pressures that they don't have the same pressures that are out there in the private sector. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia for a very generous 5 minutes.
I thank the chair, and I do want to say, I want to compliment the chair, and I hope this doesn't hurt him. But he has gone way beyond ideology on federal employee issues. We've worked together. He's made it his business to visit places of employment and listen to employees, to listen to what is happening in the workplace, and I think it's, he would say it has informed him and given him some perspective I wish more of our colleagues would take. I've done the same, and I really salute him. He's taken his job here seriously. I got to get to know the territory. You know, the old line from The Music Man, you got to know the territory. I salute Mr. Meadows for that effort. Ms. Gretzler, I take your point that sometimes we get a troubled employee, maybe ethically challenged, behaviorally disruptive, whatever it may be, and it takes a year and a half, a process that seems never-ending, an appeal may reinstore them, drives all of us crazy. But isn't there another side to the coin, and the balance is what we're trying to get at. We want to streamline that, but we also want to be fair. There's something called due process. Courts have upheld it. The federal employees are entitled to due process, even though sometimes that may aggravate us in terms of how long it takes or even the end result. And we need to respect that too, do we not?
No, we do, and they need due process, but I think what we have now is an overly burdensome hurdle. The proof required for firing federal employees exceeds that of the private sector, and I think there are things that we can do to streamline and make that possible.
Yeah.
I mean,
I understand, and I'm not unsympathetic, but I will tell you, as someone who represents a lot of federal employees and federal contract employees, there's still a lot of discrimination, favoritism, nepotism, outright outrageous discriminatory behavior, sexual harassing behavior, racially hateful behavior that goes on in a workforce as large as the federal government. And trying to make sure there's some protections for the victims of that and trying to hold people to account, really important, because sometimes the perpetrators make the victims, you know, the employees who get discharged or demoted or exiled to, you know, Nome, Alaska, or someplace where they're sort of out of sight and out of mind. I don't mean to pick on Alaska; it's a beautiful state. But so I just want to suggest to you that it's a complicated picture, and some of the protections, though they've become maybe more brittle than we would like over time, and very juridical, on the other hand, are there for a reason. Ms. Simon, I wonder if you wanted to comment on that, because I see both sides of this in the job I got.
First of all, it doesn't take a year and a half to fire a federal employee. In most cases, certainly in cases of misconduct, an employee's off the payroll in 30 days or an even shorter period of time, depending on the circumstances. If it takes a year and a half, and if the agency fails in its efforts to remove a poor performer or someone who's been proven to have engaged in misconduct, that is not a problem with the process. That is not a problem with the evidentiary burden. That is a problem with the agency and its managers and their own abilities to document what they allege. They make procedural errors. They do all kinds of things that are wrong. They propose a penalty that is not commensurate with the alleged offense.
And if I may interrupt, because I've experienced this, and sometimes people who are sort of the problem are in positions of power, and they just stonewall, which takes time.
As we had a Senate hearing yesterday in the VA committee, and our national president asked rhetorically if anyone thought that the firing that's been in the news this last week was an unusual occurrence, if they thought it never happened in other federal agencies where people were fired in order to, an executive fired a subordinate in order to cover up that executive's own misdeeds. There are all kinds of miscarriages of justice that would occur in the absence of high the current evidentiary standards for allegations of misconduct. And it is very, very foolish to consider lowering those standards so that people can just be fired willy-nilly. We'll get a very, very bad and corrupt federal government if we do so.
I thank you. Is the chairman going to give me one more minute? I thank the chair. See, if you compliment the chair, you get extra time. Wonderful chair. Have you not all noticed? So I just have one more, because I thank you both. Mr. Goldenkopf, you stated the federal compensation system should allow the government to cost-effectively attract, motivate, and retain high-performing, agile workforce necessary to meet these missions. You know, my impression from years of working in and with the federal government and representing so many federal employees is that we're nowhere near that standard. We got a long way to go in streamlining hiring process, making it easier, less bureaucratic, less paper-dominated, and frankly figuring out how do we attract that new generation that's going to replace a third of the federal workforce that's eligible for retirement in the next 3 or 4 years. How do we appeal to millennials? I mean, how do I say to a Ms. Gressler, I see a 30-year federal career in your future? You know, and we're part of the problem up here. And I just wonder if you could expand on that a little bit. What do we need to do to be more flexible and to attract and retain the talent of the future, which is the immediate future, I might add, not far away?
Well, as you mentioned, I think flexibility is the key. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So, you know, I know the focus of this hearing is pay, but pay is not the only thing. You know, even if we could assume for the moment that we can come up with the ideal pay system, it still does no good if your onboarding processes are inadequate, if you don't make effective use of their talents, if you don't aggressively recruit them, if once they do come on board, if you don't develop them, if they're not given effective supervision. And it's also a matter of work-life balance programs, and it needs to be tailored to individual labor markets. It needs to be tailored to individual occupations. And we're just not doing that effectively right now.
I thank the chair for his indulgence. Thank you all so much for being here today.
I thank the gentleman for his kind remarks, and I let the record reflect that his additional time was really in a spirit of fairness because Mr. Duncan went over, and not because of any wonderful embellished remarks to my benefit.
And for the sake of the media back home in North Carolina, I wish we could work with Mr. Meadows. It's just too conservative for all of us.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes Mr. Grothman for 5 minutes.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Conley for the comments. I don't have a lot of federal employees in my district. I haven't heard complaints from him, but if he says federal government is a hotbed of racism and sexual harassment, I'll take him at his word. I mean, it's something we got to look out for.
Would my friend yield just for a second? Sure. I know my friend knew. I was simply pointing out that in a big workforce, you know, there are some bad apples. I in no way was characterizing or meant to characterize that as the federal workforce. My experience is the opposite. The federal workforce is a pretty dedicated a group of workers, as the chairman said at the beginning of the hearing. I thank my friend for yielding.
Oh, okay. Okay, I just want to clarify that. Okay. Went a little bit overboard. Okay, now I got a question for you guys to lead off, and I don't really see it in here, but one thing that I always find when I deal with government employees, obviously many of them are regulatory, and many of them seem to just be, I assume they're nice people in their own lives, but they seem to be completely out of touch from dealing with the public, be it individuals or businesses, you know, putting burdens on them that they would never think to put on themselves. And I always wish more of them had spent some time in the private sector so they would realize how they look when they come across to the public. Does anybody have any information, say, on the number of, particularly in the regulatory agencies, the number of government employees who spent, say, at least 5 years in the public sector before being hired, or how many just came straight out of college, which would lead to the lack of common sense that you sometimes see in the federal government?
I don't have data on that directly, but I completely agree with you that there is not very much flow from the private sector to government and back. And I think that leads to some of the bigger misperceptions that we sometimes see here. Ms. Simon studies some statistics claiming that federal employees are underpaid by 34%. If you were to ask most federal employees, most believe they can make more money in the private sector than they do in government. I have done some work where we tracked the relatively small number of people who shift from federal employment to private sector jobs. Rather than getting a big pay increase, most of them actually got a pay reduction. We also tracked people who went from private sector jobs to the federal government. Most of them got pay increases. I think the lack of shifting between the two, though, leads to an insularity where you're not aware of what's going on in jobs outside the private sector, but also the concentration of federal employees within the Washington, D.C. area may lead to a lack of understanding or knowledge of what's going on outside of Washington, D.C. The five of the 10 richest counties in the United States are in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, and that's not to say anything bad about people who live in Washington, D.C., but you may not understand exactly what's going on in the rest of the country.
But most of the federal workforce is outside of D.C.
Right. Maybe I'll ask Ms. Simon. You see what I'm getting at, okay? If you work for a company and somebody from the EPA comes in and says, oh, here, I know you just put in this new equipment 4 years ago, but the rules have changed, times have changed, spend another $10 million or whatever, and that's maybe an exaggeration. But that sort of thing you hear. And you wonder, my goodness, you know what it feels like to be on the other end of the phone. Is there any effort made to say, before we hire a new person in a regulatory agency, to see if they spent 5 or 10 years on the other end of the phone? I think particularly older people in their 50s, sometimes it's harder to find a job, but they have a lot of experience. They get downsized. Is an effort being made to hire those people above somebody who just came out of college and may have no point of reference as to how the real world works?
I don't have any data that would indicate one way or another how the percentage of the current federal workforce that has spent time working in the private sector or for employees in a regulatory agency that have worked in the same industry that their agency regulates. I would tell you that it is always expected that federal employees act in a courteous manner with any member of the public that they are dealing with. Obviously, when you're in a law enforcement context, and the law enforcement may be the laws that people in the Environmental Protection Agency are paid to enforce. Businesses might not like the restrictions on their ability to use certain chemicals
I don't mean to cut you off,
or
but they limit us on time. So
equipment.
I just make one comment for my good buddies in the think tank world. I think in the future when they hire people, I'm sure they have a scale and there might be a test that people take and blah, blah, blah. I would hope time spent in the private sector is a big part of that scale, and that's something that you guys could work towards, because I think you'd get a lot better quality out of the regulatory agencies if you had people who had dealt on the other side of things. Can I ask one more question, or since I walk
I beg your pardon?
only guy, the only Republican down here?
Okay, the gentleman is recognized for 30 more seconds, and we'll do the same for the other side.
Super. We have numbers here that were given us. I mean, I just find them hard to believe. We have 108,000 federal employees making more than 150 grand a year. And where I come from, that's like the upper crust. And it just keeps skyrocketing up more and more and more. And I don't begrudge anybody making 150 grand a year. But holy cow, I mean, wow.
The vast majority of federal
Is that
employees who make salaries like that are physicians and scientists.
And you have to understand, too, that the jobs that the federal government avails themselves, for example, they're doctors, they're engineers, they're higher skilled because the nature of the work is higher skilled than in the private sector, and so that needs to be considered, too. You cannot just look at the salaries alone.
Well, I wonder if we can get for us, I mean, we got 400,000, 100 to 150, another over 100, over 150, that's 500. I mean, that's just, I wouldn't know if I would have guessed that many people were making that much in the country as a whole, but maybe I come from an area that doesn't make as much money. If we could someday get a breakdown by agency and find out, you know, from somebody.
Yeah, the gentleman's time has expired. If you will try to respond to the gentleman's request to the committee, that would be greatly appreciated. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskins, is recognized for a very generous 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your flexibility. And I do want to associate myself briefly with the remarks of the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, who did observe that at a time when we just experienced the firing of the FBI director by the president for apparently refusing to quash the investigation of a paid Russian asset, Michael Flynn. The timing of this hearing is at least a bit unusual, but as the representative of the 8th Congressional District in Maryland, where I have 88,000 federal employees, this is an issue of great interest and concern to me. Now, I take the general point to be that high-ranking public employees like doctors at NIH or the Center for Disease Control, or lawyers at the Department of Justice, or maybe on Capitol Hill, or engineers or IT people in the Pentagon are underpaid compared to what they could be making in the private sector. And certainly we know that anecdotally to be true. You talk to people all the time in government who are either leaving to go make double or triple their salaries in the private sector that they could be making, or are tempted to do it and complain about the pay and benefits being too low. And then the suggestion that there are, quote, lower-ranking employees who are overpaid compared to their private sector counterparts. And I want to focus on that for a second to figure out who we're really talking about, because I don't know to what extent you can really equate particular public sector positions with private sector positions. I think of some people who are lower paid, for example, as soldiers, but you think back to the Iraq War, there were soldiers leaving the army when they could, then making double or triple what they could as military contractors in Iraq or in Afghanistan. Maybe climate scientists, researchers could be making a lot more working in the private sector, or maybe they're making more than they, but I can't visualize who we're talking about as being overpaid within the government workforce, and I'm just wondering if anybody can help me out on that.
I'd like to take a stab at that. I think your comments point to why the CBO study is particularly inappropriate as the basis for a conversation about whether federal employees are overpaid or underpaid. In my testimony, I talked about Border Patrol agents who have a very complex, difficult, and dangerous job. Their job requires only a high school diploma. They receive additional training from the federal government before they start their jobs, but their formal education, their educational attainment is
Gotcha. So basically when they say they're overpaid, we're equating a Border Patrol agent who just has a high school degree to that person taking their high school degree and getting a job at the McDonald's across the street from the border or something like that.
In the CBO study, we're comparing it with all private sector workers with a high school education as their highest educational attainment, who might work in security services, broadly defined, which could include all kinds of security guards, mall cops,
Okay.
anything in that.
Let me ask this. So if that public-private juxtaposition isn't exactly useful to us in terms of thinking about the pay, what about, does anybody have any information on either an international perspective on what workers make in national governments abroad, or historically? And the historical context, I think, is important, because I do know that the federal government historically has been a place that's been open to people facing serious discrimination in the private sector, like women, like African Americans, who were able to get jobs there first when they were experiencing rampant discrimination. And so the fact that, a woman or an African American could get hired in the 1920s or 30s at the post office or at the Department of Labor, but not get hired in the private sector without facing extreme discrimination, that doesn't surprise me that they might be making a little bit more, and that might be something we would celebrate. But I wonder if anybody's got either any historical perspective or international perspective on it. Mr. Biggs.
From the international context, the OECD, which is a group of developed countries, has done surveys of government pay for different positions in those developed countries, so be U.S., UK, Canada, France, whatever. And for a variety of positions, they look at the U.S. federal government pays more. Just as an example, economists are paid an average of about $150,000 a year in the U.S. federal government, about $87,000 per year in other OECD countries. Somebody who's a secretary in the U.S. earns an average of about $69,000 in the federal government, about $47,000, $48,000 in other OECD countries. So this is government to government among other developed countries.
Okay. I would love to get that information from you. You're telling me that a secretary in the federal government makes an average $69,000 a year?
For secretaries, it's listed as an average of $69,476. For executive secretaries, it's listed as $98,786.
Okay. Did anybody have any historical data to see? Because, of course, one of the things we've seen is a decline in unionization for people who would be in high school graduate jobs in a lot of places in the private sector, but an improvement in unionization in the public sector. So that might account for some of the disparity. And I wonder to what extent unionization does help explain it. Ms. Simon.
One of the places you see the impact of the decline in unionization is in the data that are used for the federal government's pay system for its hourly workforce, people who work in the skilled trades. They're mostly employed by the Department of Defense and depots and arsenals, and they, on paper anyway, we have a prevailing rate system that collects data from all over the country, private sector data on what people are paying, what private employers are paying for similar jobs. And you can see month to month when an auto plant closes in a community, wages in that community go down by 35–40% because the wages paid in a union manufacturing plant are so much higher than the non-union.
So on that theory, we would not want to allow extreme inequality in the private sector to become the justification for driving wages down further in the public sector, which I take it is...
No, but I would say that that is a nice way to describe the subject of this hearing.
Yeah. All right. I think my time is up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your indulgence.
I thank the gentleman in light of the number on to my right of potential questioners. Instead of recognizing myself, I'm going to go to Ms. Kelly and recognize her for a strict 5 minutes. I'm just kidding.
That is all I'll need. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. When I saw what this topic was, I was really surprised because I've worked on every level of government and outside of government. And when I became a member of Congress, so many of the people that came to work for me had to take pay cuts. And also their health care wasn't as good as what they had otherwise. So I found that very interesting. The other thing is, and you don't have to answer the question, but it always seems like people think that if you're do government work or you're a public servant or social service that you should make less. Even though you go to college, you may have your undergrad degree, your master's degree, in some cases your PhD, but people think that you should not make more because you're just a government worker or in social service. Also, the other thing is, and I know we talked about Washington versus outside, but how many of our staffers have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, yes, 9 roommates, so they can live off the salaries that we pay them, and they don't work just straight 9-to-5 jobs. So to the very staffers in this room, it's shameful that some people make $25,000 and $30,000 despite whatever, the school loans you're saying that they get paid back, but it's still horrific in my opinion. Ms. Simon, your testimony states that the federal pay system promotes internal pay equity and prevents discrimination. You state in your testimony that this is because the system, and I quote, assigns salaries to the position, not the individual. Can you explain how you believe the federal pay system advances gender and race equity?
Yes. I also, in the testimony, cite 2014 study by the Office of Personnel Management that really does focus exclusively on the question you asked, pay equity in the federal government. The best number in that study is that well over 90% of women who are part of the senior executive service on average make almost exactly the same salaries as men in similar jobs. But that's true throughout the federal government. And Representative Raskin was asking about, or talking about historically, the federal government was the place that was open to hiring women and members of racial minority groups when the private sector refused. Not only did it hire people based solely on skills, but it pays based solely on the job. So if the holder of the job is female or male, black or white, old or young, it doesn't matter. It matters only what the job is. And that's the way that the Federal Salary Council compares private and federal pay and measures its pay gap, and that's the proper way to take a look at comparisons between federal and private pay, because the attributes of the individual, which is what the CBO study focused on, should always be irrelevant.
Thank you. You also wrote, one appalling result of Heritage's approach is the interpretation of the fact that the federal government is less likely to discriminate against women and minorities in terms of pay than the private sector. It is viewed as evidence that the government overpays relative to the private sector rather than the other way around. Are you saying that the Heritage study found a compensation premium for federal workers because the private sector is more likely to discriminate against workers than the federal government?
If you look at data on, say, African-American women with bachelor's degrees in the private sector and what they make on average, and African-American women who hold jobs in the federal sector that require bachelor's degrees, on average, the federal government pays more because it doesn't reproduce the discriminatory pay practices that we find in the non-union private sector.
And actually, there was a study done when in Chicago that reports for African-American women in the private sector that the more education you have, the bigger the pay gap grows.
In the private sector.
Right, in the private sector, right. Can you just talk about, I want you to describe the most harmful proposals and explain how they would affect federal workers when you look at what may be in President Trump's budget.
Well, we have not been privy to what's in President Trump's budget, except for one phone call I got earlier this week that described the many, many proposed cuts we can expect to see to federal retirement. They want to change the basis on which annuities would be calculated. They want to eliminate COLAs altogether for people in FERS and just 0.25% for people in CSRS. They want to eliminate the first supplement that would affect law enforcement agents who have mandatory early retirement. But the biggest and worst and most consequential would be to charge federal employees who participate in FERS anywhere from 7 to 9% of their salaries for their defined benefit. This is a massive pay cut. It's important to note, although we've been discussing here today that too few private sector employees have access to a defined benefit pension anymore. For those who do, in the private sector, about 97% of private sector employees with a defined benefit plan don't pay anything toward their pension. The employer pays the entire cost. Federal employees already pay far, far more for their pension benefit than comparable private sector employees.
Thank you, and I know I went over, but I did want to make a comment that as a ranking member of the IT subcommittee, and you've been very involved with us, that we can't keep federal employees in that division and with cybersecurity because we don't pay enough. So thank you for your indulgence.
I thank the gentlewoman. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. This discussion to me is very troubling on a lot of levels. The arrogance of individuals to target federal employees where the criticism of federal employees is that, one, that you're federal, you're a public servant, I'm paying your salary, therefore you should make less. But you have to uphold to so many restrictions when you take that oath of office, and federal employees are required to take an oath of office for ethics, for the Hatch Act, for so many things that are different from the private sector that you don't even have an expectation or requirement. There's some pluses that I wanted to go through. When we talk about career employees and why they stay there, most people go into the federal government, unlike the millennials of today, thinking that it is a career because there is upward mobility built into federal employment. So therefore, you can actually grow and get promotions based on education experience within the agency, and it is rewarded. The highest enforcement of civil rights, employment rights, are in the federal government. Ladies and gentlemen, the diversity that has historically been demonstrated in federal government, and I will say, from those who despise the fact that minorities are advancing in salary, and the federal government is the catalyst to that, is some of this displaced minimalism that we see happening with federal employees. I remember hearing my older relatives saying that when you got a job at the post office, you were considered elite in the community because it was a paid job, that you were going to be paid the same amount of money as your white counterparts, that you would be able to have a career, your job was protected, and guess what? They would enforce civil rights laws. So I'm a little sensitive when I hear this blanket conversation about federal employees. The fact that why would we not have an appeal system in the federal government for employees? You expect that if you are arrested or if you are accused of something that you would have appeal rights. And instead of saying this is a model that private industry should use, we want to dummy down the federal government, who are the keeper of our Constitution and our laws, and we want to say pay them less, make them be the lowest paid employee. And for the life of me, I'm going to try to find a secretary in the federal government that's making $67,000 or $90,000 that you have. Is an employee who has been employed for 30 years, moved up in the ranks, but I'm sorry, the starting pay, and I want to give you an example. The starting pay of a registered nurse, and this is according to VA, a practical nurse or a medical technician in VA makes about $45,000 a year. A nursing assistant makes $35,000 a year. Now, many of you know I worked for one of the federal agencies, and I was in HR. And the biggest problems we had were hiring professionals. We needed doctors, and we could not get an active doctor in the system. It was always a retired doctor that would come in because the pay was so low. It was not one that was reflective of the industry, but a retired doctor could come in and make this lower pay. And we struggle with that. We struggle with engineers. We struggle with those, and there's nowhere that you can say that a skilled professional makes more money in the federal government. They may have career status protection, and they may have opportunities within this agency. The last thing I want to say, and I'm not going to get a question in, is this issue about official time. It comes up consistently. And we're dealing with this right now in the military, where we have women who are being subjected to sexual harassment in the military. So you're telling me in order for a person who's being discriminated against, and I was an EO investigator, you're being discriminated against, you're being harassed in the workplace, guess what? Take your own personal time, take time off the clock because you're being abused in the workforce to address your complaint. When we say official time, you cannot go in there and have a cup of coffee and sit there for the whole day. You have to have a complaint. And to protect the rights of individuals in the workforce with official time, so that if I feel aggrieved, I have a process to go through. It's something that is, we keep talking about this, is we're trying to find a problem. One thing that you all are saying, and I hope we all agree on this, I want every federal employee to earn their salary. I want efficiencies. I cannot stand fraud. I take the work of a federal employee, I do place them at a higher level. And I do want to compensate them with a wage that's reflective of their skills. But I don't want our employees to be able to disregard the responsibilities that they take an oath to do. Thank you.
I thank the gentlewoman. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Demings, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. You know, a few minutes ago, I heard a comment that too many federal employees, particularly those coming in, don't have a point of reference of how the real world works. Well, I would venture to say many times Congress acts as if it does not have a point of reference of how the real world works. As we all know, there have been growing inequality in wages, with the highest earners keeping more of the total wages that are paid in this nation. This is likely why the CBO has found a disparity in wages between the public and private sectors, particularly for the least educated workers. Mr. Cowell, workers in the federal government, including by our calculations, about 31,700 people in Texas, and more than 36,000 people in California with no more than a high school education were paid just about 34% more than similarly educated workers in the private sector. Is that correct?
We did not look at the breakdowns by state, but we do find on average the differences in compensation by education that we've been talking about today.
So is the percentage based on the percentage? Would you say generally that percentage is correct?
So the percentage difference in total comp for people with a high school diploma or less was 53. And that's a national average.
The Bureau of Labor Statistics and other experts have observed that in some cases, benefits inequality between the highest and lowest earners has been even starker than wage inequality. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, only 33% of private sector workers have earnings whose earnings put them in the lowest 25% of wage earners had access to employer-provided health care. However, Ms. Simon, every full-time federal employee has access to the federal employee health benefits plan, even the lowest paid, least educated employee in the federal government. Is that correct?
That's correct. But it also, I just want to add to what was just said. It's not, the problem with the CBO study is not that the employer provides the benefit, it's the differences in the cost of the benefit provided. It costs the federal government more to provide the benefit, the same retirement benefit, than it costs a private employer. And that is a necessary piece of information that to be included in any financial comparison of the cost of benefits. It's not the benefits, but the cost of benefits. The employer cost
retirement,
providing
health
the benefit.
insurance, paid leave.
The Federal Employee Health Benefits Program also costs the government more than it should, given the benefits it provides. There are structural flaws in FEHBP that make it more expensive than it should be. The actuarial cost of the benefit versus what the premiums are, there are flaws in the structure of FEHBP that make it much more expensive than it should be. And I wouldn't call the restriction on the investment of the assets in the Civil Service Retirement Trust Fund a flaw, but it makes it more expensive than a similar private pension plan that would provide the exact same benefit.
CBO found that benefits for federal employees with no more than a high school education cost about 93% more than benefits for private sector employees with no more than a high school education. In other words, the difference between public and private sector benefits for employees with only a high school education were larger, as you've just said, Ms. Cowell, than the difference in the wages paid by the public and private sector to these employees. Is that correct, Mr. Cowell?
Yes, that's correct.
If Republicans cut benefits for federal workers with no more than a high school education so that they are comparable to benefits paid by the private sector with comparable levels of education, according to your findings, the federal workers would get to keep about 7% of their benefits. Mr. Cowell, has the CBO examined what medical benefits, retirement benefits, and leave federal workers with no more than a high school education would actually have if they receive only 7% of the benefits that they currently receive? Have you examined that?
No, that's something we have not examined.
Ms. Simon, would you like to comment on whether the benefits earned by federal workers with no more than a high school education are 93% too generous?
The benefits are
Ms.
not
Simon,
too generous, they're too expensive.
Ms. Simon, her time is expired, but please answer the question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Don't treat me differently.
No, I would never treat you differently.
Ms.
Go ahead.
Simon.
No,
Oh,
please
I
answer.
said the benefits are hardly too generous. They are, I think the health insurance benefits are too expensive. I think that we would benefit from a self-insured program in FEHBP. As far as the cost to the employer and cost to the government of providing the retirement benefit, there's very, very good reason for that, as I described in my testimony, because of the rate of return on Treasury bonds compared to private equities. And so the provision of benefits has to take into consideration the cost of providing the benefits, not the benefits themselves.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman. Ms. Simon, let me make sure I can clarify one thing in following up on her testimony there, or your testimony, her questions. Are you saying that the benefits that federal workers get are not better, they're just more poorly administered on behalf of the federal government? Because you said that it was just not, the federal government was not efficient, I guess, in doing that. I'm trying to understand where she was going with, and you said it's not better benefits, it's just they're not, it's more costly to administer it in the federal government?
Yes, I didn't say because, and it's structural issues. The FEHBP has problems with risk segmentation. It doesn't have one benefits package. It squanders the purchasing power of what is the largest employer.
So you're saying the federal government is not administering their retirement program as well as the private sector?
No, I was just talking about the federal.
Well, that's what it
employees'
sounded
health-
like.
I was talking about the federal employee health benefits program.
So they're not
I think there are
implementing
structural
it.
flaws in that plan. I'm not saying that OPM
So this gets back
implements
to
it
the
poorly.
previous question. You think they ought to go all on Obamacare?
No, sir.
Okay, well, we'll follow up on that. Mr. Sarbanes, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
Close enough, Mr. Chairman. We're both physically close to one another here, and I do want to say that Chairman and I share something in common. It's my understanding you started off in the restaurant business, Aunt D's.
Boy, you Googled me pretty well there, yeah.
Well, we have something in common. I always admire somebody who's owned restaurants, having managed and owned them for 35 years. My mistake was, as opposed to you, I stayed in it. I wished I had gone into real estate because there's more money in real estate than there is in the restaurant business. But I really think this is too bad. I think it's a reasonable question to ask. From my perspective, having been in the private sector in a very competitive field where I needed to compensate and treat my employees well, owning restaurants in the San Francisco Bay Area, which was very competitive, low profit margin. If I didn't treat my employees well, I was out of business in no time. And I saw lots of people who invested in lots of businesses who were out of time, particularly the retail business. So I think the question should be, how do we as Americans, clearly in this day and age, get wages and benefits up for all working Americans. And I perceived the last election as being an argument about that both parties had left that behind. Today, according to Forbes magazine, the 20th wealthy Americans possessed as much wealth as 152 million Americans. We've never had that concentration of wealth in this country. There's plenty of good arguments as to why we need to fix that. And I've never understood as a manager of people how blaming rank and file people for operational problems is going to solve your management problems. My experience in the public sector, having served at every level of government, usually our problems were cultural or management level, and I've heard that in this committee over and over again. So forgive me for indulging in that little editorial comment, but I really do think it would serve this committee, and I know a lot of us on this side of the aisle would like to talk about how we get greater efficiencies in government. For those of us who believe in government, we want excellence in government. To the Heritage Foundation, I heard you earlier talk about the good employee who feels trapped. I think that happens in public and private organizations, and I'm sure you understand that as well. So how do we change that? And I really think this committee would be better served trying to figure out what is it we could do based on peer-reviewed analytical analysis to improve customer service. I think it's really difficult when members complain about the IRS customer service at the same time when you cut your revenues by almost a third. And I'm sure the GAO has done studies on what the appropriate level in each workforce in terms of what wages and compensation should be and what the revenue should be and what that would equate to in terms of customer service. And maybe the GAO can respond to that. But first, I'd like Ms. Simon to respond to that from your experience. How do you get federal employees, from your experience, to get compensated well in a competitive market? In the Bay Area, it's hard to keep federal employees. I know my district office, I'm losing a great person who worked for Google and is going to go back to work for them because he can get paid 3 times the amount of money in an area of the country that if you make $105,000, you are considered poor vis-a-vis the housing market. So maybe you could respond to that. What's the right compensation in your view, understanding that you argue as appropriately for your members?
Well, I'm also a member of the Federal Salary Council, and we are given the opportunity to look at large quantities of data that show disparities between federal pay and non-federal pay on a locality-by-locality basis. And we see these disparities. We see it by occupation. We see it by location. My colleagues here today are talking about low quit rates. One of the things that I've seen in my long career representing federal employees is that salaries, people who go into federal service expect to have fair compensation, but they don't do it to get rich. It's because they are very, very committed to the mission of their agencies. You've got people working in healthcare in the Department of Veterans Affairs, over a third of whom are veterans themselves, and they have devoted their careers to that kind of work. You've got people working in EPA who care deeply about the future of this planet and care about public health and clean air and clean water. And they have committed their lives to working in those kinds of agencies. Border Patrol agents who put their lives on the line, federal corrections officers who put their lives on the line every day, but they're very committed to public safety. They also have to raise their families. And we, in the last 10 years or so, but really the last 9 years, have suffered horrendous cuts in compensation, big retirement cuts, 3 years of pay freeze followed by minuscule pay adjustments. And no other group of Americans has had to bear such a huge burden for the politics of budget austerity. About $189 billion and counting have come out of the pockets of federal employees, partly because they're demonized routinely, partly because of these ridiculous studies that turn into misleading headlines about federal employees being overpaid. We had reference earlier today to federal employees who make over $100,000 as if that were some kind of scandal, when most of those professionals who are earning that kind of salary, as you point out, could make much, much more in the private sector. So it's really a matter of funding. and changing the conversation in this country away from the idea that only the very, very wealthy deserve to live a decent life.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Cartwright, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kyle, thank you for being here. I want to drill down on some of the figures noted in the CBO report, comparing the pay of federal and private sector workers, if I may. Your report finds that federal workers with a bachelor's degree or less received more total compensation than their private sector counterparts, ranging from 21% more for employees with a bachelor's degree to as high as 53% more for employers with no more than a high school diplomas. Am I correct in that?
Yes, that's correct.
So according to data from OPM, more than 1 million federal employees have no more than a bachelor's degree. That's about half of all executive branch employees. And I know that CBO analyzed data from the current population survey. However, assuming CBO's study is correct, we'd have to conclude that the compensation of more than 1 million federal employees is higher than compensation provided to their private sector counterparts with similar education levels. If our Republican colleagues insist that federal compensation be realigned with private sector compensation, that would mean that the compensation of more than 1 million federal employees would need to be cut. Many employees would see their total compensation cut in half. But OPM data show also that veterans comprise about 30% of the federal workforce. So if you take those numbers together, it appears that of the 1 million federal employees who make more than their private sector counterparts, as many as 300,000 of them may be veterans of the United States military. Ms. Simon, nice to see you again. What do you think? Do you think veterans in the federal government are overpaid?
I think for the most part, veterans who serve in the federal government are underpaid. And I think that it's some of the discussion that has occurred in this hearing earlier, talking about taking away appeal rights from federal employees for adverse actions, will fall most heavily on veterans and veterans with service-connected illnesses and disabilities, because that really has been the focus of attempts to punish federal employees. They want to punish by taking away their ability to defend themselves when they're against allegations that they haven't performed well enough at their job in spite of their disabilities, and now they want to take away some of their pay.
Well, I want to stay on the veterans theme. Unlike the vast majority of the private sector, the federal government has made it a priority to hire veterans by giving them a statutory preference in hiring. As a result, nearly 1/3 of new hires in the federal government are United States military veterans. Let's take a look at the VA, for example. About 1/3 of its employees are veterans. Psychiatric practical nurses and medical technicians in the VA make about $45,000 a year, and nursing assistants make about $35,000 a year. Ms. Simon, do you believe that these individuals are overpaid by 52% or even 21%?
They're definitely not overpaid, they're underpaid. And as we talked about before, what seems to raise the ire of some people who look at these data is that in the non-union sector, people who are performing similar jobs or have similar educational attainment receive no health insurance benefits from their employer, receive no retirement benefits from their employer, and they think the federal government ought to follow that race to the bottom. And of course, that is not something that AFGE supports.
Well, now, some members of Congress intend to use CBO's report to justify slashing federal employee pay and benefits, but I just want to caution that we proceed cautiously in this area, because we're all good little capitalists here, and we know that in a free market economy and also wherever you hire people, you get what you pay for. And if you continue to do, as you mentioned, Ms. Simon, beating up on federal employees, beat up on your employees, beat them up, cut their pay, make them feel bad about themselves, the best ones are going to wander off, and you're going to be left with what's left. And do we really want to do that when we run the federal government? Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence.
I thank the
yield
gentleman.
back.
The gentleman's closing sentence would indicate that you don't always get what you pay for. I'll recognize Mr. Cummings, the ranking member, for line of questioning.
Let me, first of all, to all the federal employees who may be watching today, I want to take a moment to thank you for what you do. I want to thank you for giving your blood, your sweat, and your tears to all of us to make our lives better. I've talked to many of you many times and asked why is it that you got into federal employment? And over and over and over again, I hear words like, I wanted to do something that would last forever. At the end of my day, they would say, or many of you have said, it's not the pay I get, it's the deeds I do for other people. And, you know, every time I hear those words, and then we have people that have come to us many times, and I'll say, you know, where you working? Well, I'm working at this law firm. They'll tell me how much they're making, and I'll say, well, wait, this job doesn't even pay near that. And this happens to me almost every other month. What are you doing here? You're not going to make that kind of money. And you know what they say? They say, you know what, I've been doing this other job for 15 years, 20 years. I'll take a pay cut. I'll take a pay cut because I want, at the end of my day and at the end of my life, to be able to say I gave. And so I take my moment to thank all of you who may be watching here today. The other thing that I would say to our federal employees is something that somebody said to me a long time ago. I know many times you get your paychecks and then you listen to this hearing and you listen to the people who have spoken here today, and you get your paychecks and you go to the supermarket and you're the ones who have to get the subtotal. You're the ones who are sitting there with your calculator. You're the ones that leave those groceries behind because you don't have enough money. You're the ones who get up at 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning, dress the baby, and then try to race to work, and then you're worried all day. And then you hear people talking about it's a big bonus because you got some babysitting services. Please. You're the ones that worry. You're the ones at NIH that when we had the government shutdown, you're the ones who were worried. The nurse that I talked to at NIH, she said, I'm so upset when we had the government shutdown. And I said, why are you so upset? She said, because when they did the shutdown, what that does is it stops us from being able to continue some experiments or some research that could have saved lives. It's not about the money. It's bigger than that. And so I could spend all my time asking a lot of questions, but I'm not going to do that. I want to just thank you because you don't get thanked enough. You don't get thanked enough. Over and over again, you hear criticism. Over and over again, you hear people talk about what you're not doing, and I thank you for what you are doing. Now, before Mr. Meadows I think I'm talking about him because I'm not. Meadows is a good guy. I mean, I really believe that he wants balance, and I understand that. He and I have talked many times about whatever we're doing being effective and efficient, period. And in order to be effective and efficient, you got to have good people. I was telling him a few minutes ago, it's very rare that I fire anybody because I try to hire the right people. And so, I just wanted to take that moment because, there's this program that they do every year, I forget the name of it, where they honor federal employees. And every time I go to that program, I got to tell you, it gets very emotional. Because usually it's somebody who's unseen, unnoticed, unappreciated, and unapplauded. And somebody took time to recognize what they did or do. And, you know, I just want federal employees to know that, I think it was Ms. Lawrence that said, all of us want the best. All of us want employees that go the extra mile. All of us want to be employees. By the way, we're federal employees. We need to go the extra mile too. And I think when you look at members of Congress and the time that we put in, I don't know a member of Congress that has a 9-to-5 job. I don't know any of them. If they do, they're not in office, that's for sure. Or even a 6 or say, it's usually 7 days a week. And so we are all here to serve. But you know what? Your name may never appear on the front page of the Washington Post. Federal employees, your name may never appear in WTOP or even your local Gazette. But I want to thank you on behalf of a Congress, a grateful Congress, for what you do every day to make our lives better. Thank you for teaching us, by the way, the power of sacrifice. Thank you for giving us examples of people who are not selfish, but are about the business of making people's lives better. With that, I will yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for his kind comments and for his diligence in trying to make sure that our federal workforce is indeed efficient and effective, to use your words. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for series. Oh, all right, Mr. Sarbanes, we're going to go ahead and let you pop in for a very strict 5 minutes, if you would.
Sarbanes from Maryland.
From Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Before I move to my comments, I just wanted to ask unanimous consent to enter a document into the record. This is a report from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities on wage stagnation faced by middle and lower wage workers in recent decades.
Without objection.
Thank you. I thank the panel for your testimony today. I want to associate myself with the comments of Ranking Member Cummings, and I also want to salute the chairman because I know that he has brought close attention to the situation faced by our federal employees. We're all trying to get to the right place in terms of providing the support and resources that are needed. This comparison I think we do on an annual basis between the kind of private sector workforce and the compensation and benefits and so forth that are available in the private sector and how that compares to what is offered to the federal workforce. It seems the frame is always reversed from the position that I think makes most sense. We look at the comparison. We get this testimony, which obviously is subject to debate about the fact that the federal employees have access to a broader set of benefits and compensation and overall have higher compensation in certain categories than what's in the private sector. And oftentimes the conclusion that people want to draw from that is that we should take something away from the federal employees, that we should, in a sense, degrade the package of benefits and compensation that's available to them. But I think that, in fact, what we offer our federal employees is a model and a standard that we ought to be thinking about how we can get the private sector to raise its standards up to that level. I think Ms. Gressler, you talked about the fact that federal employees have access to some daycare benefits and some assistance with student loan repayment. Well, okay, if I'm somebody working in the private sector and I'm listening to this hearing and I'm hearing that there's some benefits available to the federal workforce that help with daycare. The answer to the fact that there's a discrepancy there between the federal workforce and the private sector shouldn't be to invite the private sector person to say, well, the way to solve the discrepancy is to take it away from the federal employee. The way to address the discrepancy is for that private sector person to say, well, I'd like to have that benefit too. That's a valuable benefit. How can I add that to the compensation package? And we ought to be trying to promote with private sector employers that that's a legitimate benefit that ought to be offered to people. When you look at the pensions, and Representative Lynch talked about this at the outset, we ought to be trying to find ways to strengthen and lift up, and really in some ways completely overhaul the private pension system in this country so it reflects more of the characteristics of what we've been able to achieve with respect to the federal workforce. We need to bring up the standards that are out there in the private sector, not knock down the standards of what is a model in terms of the federal workforce. A decent wage, not subject to bias, as you pointed out, Ms. Simon, is something we ought to be reaching for in the private sector. That's why many of us argue for a national minimum wage. Let's bring up what's happening out there for all of the workers in America, not degrade what's available to the federal workforce. And then the last comment I just wanted to make is there's this suggestion that's made that because the phones aren't being answered in a timely way in this agency, or there's a casework backup in some other agency, that reflects a substandard federal employee. But the fact of the matter is that hiring freezes or the threatening of that or other cuts to resources that should support our federal workers are often the reason that that's happening. So we got to be very careful about putting that kind of narrative out. So as I close, I just want to thank our federal workforce for the great work that they do, and let's see if we can be enlightened enough to go out and work to get the private sector to embrace some of these standards and benefits that the federal workforce has. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. I now recognize the chairman, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows.
I thank the chairman. I thank him for his willingness to fill in his old seat. That is certainly one that has seen a lot of great work from his perspective and the perspective of many others. So let me go ahead and follow up. I apologize. I've got somebody. Actually, I've got someone from the continent of Africa that is here who came for surgery here in America, because as much as we're dealing with problems here, it is still the greatest country on the face of this globe, and as we look at this, it's critically important. So I've got to run right after that, but let me go ahead and follow up on a few things. Mr. Biggs, we're going to have civil service reform. And so the testimony that all of you have here today will play a factor in that. And yet I'm at a point of where I've got Ms. Simon saying one thing, I got the CBO, Mr. Kyle, saying another, I've got you and Ms. Gretzler saying different things. So I need you to help me understand why, from your perspective, Ms. Simon is wrong. And all I'm wanting to get at are the facts.
If you need to know one thing about the figures that come out of the Federal Salary Council, they claim that federal employees are on average receive salaries 34% below those of non-federal employees. Non-federal doesn't just mean private sector. Non-federal means state and local government workers. If you look at the BLS data they use, those data show that state and local government workers receive about the same salaries as private sector workers with similar skills, similar job demands. So what the Federal Salary Council is telling you is that federal employees on average receive salaries that are 34% below those of state and local government workers. Go to anybody in state and local government, they will laugh if you say that. I mean, I've been in similar hearings, we've had people who worked in state government, they say, we can't keep employees in state government because they'll go to the federal government if they have the chance.
All right, so you
It's just
say
the wrong
that you'll go to anybody and laugh. I appreciate that. She can come up and go to anybody and laugh with your testimony as well. So here's what I need. I need some facts. Why is it wrong in terms of the comparison? I need data points as we look at this.
The technical reason that is wrong is a problem what we call overgrading in the federal government, which both the CBO and the GEO have documented, which means that you have a position that has the skill demands of, say, a GS-8, but you'll be assigned, say, a GS-9 or a GS-10. That's a way of raising pay for the employee. When the data they use from the BLS to compare to private sector, state and local government workers, the BLS itself looks at the job and says, by our judgment, we think this job is equivalent to a GS-8 on the federal government scale. The BLS does not look at federal government jobs and do their own assessment of what the skill demands the job is. They take it for granted that the federal pay scale is correct, that the job is correctly assigned.
So they come from an assumption that the scale is the benchmark, not the duties that are performed. Is that correct?
So what you need to do is have the BLS go look at federal positions, do their own assessment of the skill demands of the jobs, just like they do with private sector positions, just like they do with state and local government positions. I guarantee you that 34% figure will shrink considerably.
All right, so would AEI and Heritage, would you be willing to look at both the CBO score and Ms. Simon, as she is put forth from a federal workforce, and point out both the valid, from your perspectives, valid and non-valid assumptions so that we can hopefully make a more informed decision? Are both of you willing to do that?
I'd be happy to.
All right.
I would like to point out one place that I have agreement with Ms. Simon here, and that's in the pensions and the fact that the federal government is not effectively managing them because that's going into treasuries. Treasuries do not earn the average rate of return that other things do, and so I agree wholeheartedly. And by shifting employees, taking that government contribution that's into a defined benefit plan that's not actually invested anywhere, it's used to pay for current government spending, instead of shifting that guarantees the lowest possible rate of return into a thrift savings plan, you can actually get greater returns, greater pension or retirement benefit with a smaller contribution there.
But we need to be careful there, because as we go into that, if you take that scenario out further, and you apply it to other things like Social Security, we run into a number of things that potentially her argument doesn't hold weight because of the counter argument that's made in the exact opposite paradigm for Social Security, quote, privatization. Would you not agree with that?
I don't think that the government should be investing the money themselves, but that's why you take it out of a defined benefit plan and you give ownership to the individual, because you can look at the state and local pension plans and say, yes, they have the ability to invest in whatever they want. And what they've done with that, in large part, is play politics with pensions, promise far more than they can afford
All
to
right,
pay.
I'm running out of time, so let me say this. Mr. Kyle, I would ask you to do the same and say, there's been a lot of accusations that CBO is not accurate on this, which I find really interesting, because when CBO says something that we like, we use it. When they don't, we really condemn it. Both sides do that. I find that they're condemning you today, but yet they use the CBO to justify their arguments on the Affordable Care Act at the same time. So I find it a little bit, a little hypocrisy in that. So here's what I would ask you to do is look at your study as it relates to the charges that Ms. Simon made, in terms of what you didn't consider, and I heard you loud and clear, and I want you to see if you can address that. I can probably instruct you a little bit more to get back to this committee than I can as a request for the others. What would be a reasonable time period to do that? In 60 days?
Let me talk to my colleagues and figure out when we can get back to you on that. But
okay, if you can give us an update with the time frame within the next 14 days, so that way we know what to respond to, that would be great.
Yes, we can do that.
All right. I want to thank all of you, and Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back to you.
Thank the gentleman. Thank you for yielding back. I'm going to be brief, and I don't anticipate a full second round, but the ranking member may have some additional questions. But I want to just try to bring this to some summation of some things that I hope we agree on. Ms. Simon, I'll go to you first. There's been a lot of discussion. If this committee, which certainly has the jurisdiction, the capability, did a modernization of the pension and allowed people, let's say, at their 5th year when they vest under the current system, to opt into a rollover to a TSP, all the funds, including our portion, would that be something that you believe could be in their best interest if they decide it's in their best interest?
No, absolutely not. The current federal retirement system really was created in the era of Ronald Reagan. It was a bipartisan compromise.
No, I understand. I understand how we did away with the 2.5% and no Social Security. We went into this defined benefits. But I'd like you to answer the question as to why you would object to essentially people taking control of the entire amount that would otherwise be held by the government for decades and putting it into something that they could borrow against, they could invest against, and they could use as they please, as they do more often in the private sector.
The reason we would oppose that, and we would advise our members strongly not to do that, God forbid if Congress did vote to take away people's defined benefit plan, is because—
Ma'am, I don't mind your using a lot of terms, but let's just agree to one. We were saying if Congress decided to give them the option, at their option and their option only, to opt out. So please don't use the word take away. When we give an option, it's not a taking away of a right.
I was referring to a proposal that would grandfather in people. The option would only be available to existing employees, and new employees would have no
right. No, I'm
opportunity.
simply asking a question that I think Heritage and AEI were referring to, which is, and I think CBO and GAO would score it as likely neutral in the long run. It might cost us in the 10-year window because the money would disappear, even though technically it isn't ours. But leaving all of the technical stuff, simply the question of, as a representative of these employees, do you believe that they should have that choice, and if not, why?
The arguments, as Mr. Meadows said, are the same arguments against Social Security privatization. These retirement savings vehicles put all the risk of future retirement income adequacy onto the worker. If the stock market happens to decline by a substantial amount at the moment that a particular worker has chosen or is forced to retire, that will have a huge impact on their ability to support themselves in retirement. Yet if they have a defined benefit, that won't happen to them.
I understand your answer, but I want to ask from a standpoint of CBO particularly, is it reasonably easy for you to, or maybe GAO would study it, and then there's Heritage, who is so kind to study us, the performance of TSPs on behalf of the workforce over any given period, and the performance of their pension plan over the same period of time, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, I'm going to suspect that you can come back to us and show that TSP, which is not an invest in just anything, it's a broad investment base, has outperformed the defined benefit plan, and every single federal worker, given that same amount of dollars moved into the other plan, would get more money over any period of time we could study, going back to Reagan. Ms. Gesner.
Yes, that's absolutely what you would see. And by definition, if you're giving workers the choice to have this money, the exact same amount, there's really not a way that they would have less. All they have is a choice. As Ms. Simon pointed out, those funds are ineffectively invested in the Treasury. They could be ineffectively invested in Treasury by that worker's own option, and that's the lowest return they would get. If they make other choices, they would have higher returns.
Mr. Kyle, I'm not going to ask you the same question. I'm going to add to it for a moment. In your, and I'm not asking you to shoot completely from the hip, but as you know, the federal workforce has a disincentive to stay past their pension vesting. When you reach, depending upon the scale, let's just say 55 and you've got 25 years, you're really working for a fraction of your pay. And if you leave and go to another job, you can immediately collect both pay and health care benefits for life with escalations. If you stay, you essentially have a de minimis accrual. Is that correct?
That sounds correct, yes.
Okay, so if, although...
Actually, Congressman, the accrual stays the same, but I understand your point about what's being foregone with the other job.
Right, but, yes, okay. So the question is, if there is a disincentive for the federal workforce to stay, and if we were to go to a system that essentially in perpetuity, we say, look, we're going to continue allowing you to roll your money into your own defined benefits plan, where, in a sense, no matter how long you work, your money continues to accrue and compound and outperform, as we've been told, and I think it'll be documented, outperform the government's defined benefit plan. Would we, in your estimation, be able to hold on to the federal workforce longer and as a result have a lower cost that comes with the turnover of experienced federal employees?
That's something that we would have to look into. We haven't studied that effect on turnover or retirement. There are a fair number of employees who continue on beyond their retirement eligibility and forego some of those retirement benefits that you alluded to.
Okay, well, to the extent that you have the ability to study it, I'd appreciate knowing about it. Ultimately, this hearing today really is about what's in the best interest of the federal employment base. I'm going to go to the ranking member in just a moment, but I just want to, I don't expect to do an additional follow-up. I think a lot of areas were dealt with here today. The one that I heard both here and when I was listening in the other room was that we do not currently have a system that determines what the fair compensation is in a region for essentially a like job, meaning what we tell our contractors is that they must pay a prevailing wage, and they go out and they advertise and people come in and that establishes a prevailing wage. At least with some regularity, that wage would be much less. And when it's more, generally we're asked to pay when it's more, but we don't get the benefit when the prevailing wage is less. And I think I heard that fairly broadly, and it's the inherent nature of a one-size-fits-all step system. Would most or all of you agree to that? Okay. Ms. Simon, I'll note that you shook your head no, that you believe every employee being paid in Mississippi and in Silicon Valley the exact same wage is okay.
Well, in the federal government, they aren't.
Exactly. In the federal government, if it's in Mississippi, if it's too low, there's no process to take it away. But in Silicon Valley, we do pay a COLA premium, right?
Are you asking me if the federal government lowers wages ever?
Yes. Is there a negative COLA?
Not that I'm familiar with.
Thank you. I go to the ranking member for his comments.
I'm going to be very brief. I want to, again, thank all of you for being here today. And I want to associate myself with what Mr. Sarbanes said, my colleague from Maryland. You know, we can race to the bottom and cut, or we can have a high standard for our employees. So, if we want to do these comparisons and look to see what we should be cutting, looking at private sector, we ought to reverse it, because it's not only what we are doing for the employees, we are also concerned about what the employees are doing for our constituents. And we want employees that want to be around. We want high morale. And I know the lady from the District of Columbia talks about this all the time, that we should have high expectations of our employees, and I've talked about that. And we talk about it because it's so important. You can, before you got here, Ms. Norton, you're talking about the fact that, some of the employees are able to get maybe discounted babysitting services or the bus fare, being able to get, and those are things that are incentives for people to work for us. Am I right, Ms. Simon?
Yes.
Yeah, and so I think we need to be racing to the top as opposed to trying to go the opposite direction of racing in that direction. And again, I'm concerned about our customers. I'm concerned about the people who sent us here, because I want them to have good services. I remember when I first came to Congress, I told my office, I still do this, I wanted to run my office like a law firm, because I'd practiced law for many years. And I wanted to run it like a law firm because I wanted the people that came into the office to feel like they were being treated as if, you know, they were paying us millions of dollars, because I wanted them to have high expectations of the staff. And then the staff felt good about what they were doing. We were able to put out a good product. And again, I talked earlier about how, you know, people come into federal service, the ones I've talked to, because they really, really want to make a contribution to society. And so, again, I want to thank you all for being here, and I'll yield back.
Thank you. And I'd like to close with just a question, which is completely not going to be difficult for 3 out of the 5 of you. From CBO, GAO, and are you on FEHBP? Are you a federal worker? You're not.
No.
You're on the union side. So for 2 of you, what do you think about the Federal Employee Health Care Benefit Plan? Do you feel that in this era of everyone, this consternation about health care, do you feel that you're in the quiet of the storm by having hundreds of choices and programs that you can choose from for your health care as a federal worker?
So I think I'd rather go back to to what we say in the report, where we talk about the cost of benefits by type rather than, you know, providing a personal opinion.
Okay, so you're good with the report. I'll ask, healthcare, as a federal employee receiving FEHBP with an 80% match from the federal government, are you pretty happy?
I am happy, but I have nothing to compare it to either, and you know, I have no private sector experience on this outside of my area of expertise.
Okay, well, I'm going to close by saying I miss it. I've been in Obamacare now for a number of years, and I truly miss the Federal Employee Health Benefit Plan, which I'm proud to say, for all the discussions that may go on, continues to be a program that is able to bid all over the country and try to meet the needs of the federal workforce. So I say that because this hearing is important. The ranking member is right about one thing. We do need to motivate the federal workforce. We do need to remind people that they do serve, and although we get to determine what the fair price is when we employ them, at the same time, it's not their problem if they're, if you will, compensated at a rate that statistics show might not be the same. They came to work, they took the schedule, and they performed the jobs. And so I want to thank you all for your testimony today. The record will stay open for 3 legislative days in order to have any extensions or questions answered. And with that, we stand adjourned.